At my youngest son's wedding, just as the guests were standing up and the live strings began drifting through the ocean breeze of California's Monterey Peninsula, our wedding photographer slipped over to my side. Without even looking at me, he kept his eyes straight ahead and whispered under his breath, "I need 90 seconds of your time right now." The smile froze on my face. I followed him to a quiet, secluded corner near the estate's cliffs, where he turned his camera's viewfinder toward me. On the screen was a photo of my oldest son, standing completely alone inside the mansion's locked, off-limits library. He was leaning over a stack of legal documents he had absolutely no business touching. Then the photographer handed me a single loose page he'd picked up from just outside the bottom of the door. In that exact moment, everything I thought I knew about my family and everything this day was supposed to be began to fall apart. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my story today. Before we dive into the details, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to make a choice to protect your family where there was no right answer, and someone was going to get hurt either way? Your perspective might help someone else going through the same kind of pain feel a little less alone. Just a quick note before we go further, some minor details in this story have been altered for creative purposes, but the core truth of what happened is entirely real. I woke up at 6 that morning, 2 full hours before my alarm was set to go off. Staring at the empty side of the bed where my wife used to sleep, I knew this was the very last day I could pretend my oldest son wasn't actively trying to ruin my life. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the master bedroom, the Pacific Ocean stretched out, vast and gray. This view of Monterey Bay was the exact scene Eleanor and I had looked out at together for 38 years. I reached over to pick up her photograph from the nightstand. Well, it was just my nightstand now, though I'd never moved it from her side. I traced the sterling silver frame as reverently as a believer making the sign of the cross. In the picture, she was smiling at me during our 30th wedding anniversary party. She looked radiant in that deep navy silk gown, her hair swept up elegantly the way she always styled it when she wanted to look her best. That was 4 years ago, back when laughing came easily and she could breathe without any effort. When Marcus gets married, Arthur, she had told me that night, a bit emboldened by the champagne, that's when we'll know for sure we finally did something right in this life. It's been 3 years since she passed away. I still find myself turning around out of habit, wanting to tell her about my day, collecting countless little stories in my head for a listener who will never hear them. I set the frame down and pulled open the top drawer of the mahogany nightstand. Resting right beneath her reading glasses, which I still can't bring myself to move, and the bookmark still tucked into a novel she never got to finish, was a small, black leather notebook. Inside were exactly 28 days of entries. For nearly a month, I had watched my oldest son place his pieces on the board like a grandmaster, while I played dumb and pretended to notice nothing. I had uncovered the truth 4 weeks ago, and on this particular morning, I decided it was time to end it. To an outsider, the notes on those pages might have looked like harmless coincidences. May 12th, Julian asks the trust executors about the transfer timeline for Sterling Aerospace's patent portfolio. May 19th, Richard Coburn, our family wealth manager for 20 years, suddenly goes completely off the grid for a full week. May 26th, Dr. Thorne calls to confirm a psychiatric evaluation appointment that I had never scheduled. Every single entry was written in my precise, compact engineer's handwriting. Every subtle betrayal meticulously documented. I slid the notebook into the inside pocket of my vest, where it would rest right against my chest all day. Some men carry photos of their family. I carried evidence. I took a shower, turning the water up so hot it almost stung, a habit I'd picked up ever since Eleanor passed. Sometimes that sharp physical sensation was the only thing that made me feel alive, like I could actually still feel something. I got dressed slowly, a bespoke charcoal suit, an ivory shirt, and the titanium cufflinks Marcus had given me for Christmas last year, engraved with the word "father" in his precise marine biologist handwriting. In the mirror, I looked exactly like the man I was supposed to be today. Arthur Sterling, 68 years old, widowed for 3 years, father of the groom, and the retired founder and chief engineer of an aerospace components manufacturing firm. My posture was still perfectly straight, but what the mirror didn't show was a man who had spent 30 years across negotiating tables, learning exactly how people betray their true intentions through their words. It didn't show the man who had built a multi-million-dollar defense contracting empire simply by knowing exactly when an opponent was bluffing and when they had run out of moves. Julian thought I was losing my mind, slipping into old age. That was his first major mistake. At 7:30, I found him out in the estate's courtyard. He was wearing an incredibly expensive custom Tom Ford suit, looking like the absolute picture of a devoted son. The moment he saw me walking down the stone steps, his expression instantly shifted into pure, warm affection. He had inherited Eleanor's eyes, deep, expressive, and incredibly deceptive. "Dad," he said, walking across the courtyard and reaching out to adjust my tie, which was already perfectly straight. "You look great today. Mom would be so happy to see you like this." "She'd be happy to see Marcus finding love," I replied, letting him fix my collar. Out of nowhere, Julian produced a white boutonniere, pinning it to my lapel with the steady, practiced hands of someone used to signing venture capital deals. At 41, he was already a senior partner at a top Silicon Valley VC firm. My oldest son had always been meticulous. A long time ago, back when I still believed that precision went hand in hand with integrity, that trait was my greatest source of pride. "Dad, just relax and enjoy today," he said, stepping back to admire his work. "I've taken care of everything. Everything is completely under control." His emphasis on that second everything was incredibly subtle, barely noticeable to anyone else, but I caught it. I watched him manage the morning like a maestro conducting a symphony. With surgical precision, he corrected the florist's table arrangements, stopped the catering manager to hand down strict directives disguised as casual small talk, and poured me a cup of black coffee. Exactly how I'd taken it for 40 years. No cream, no sugar, setting it on the side table right next to me. But as he did all this, I noticed a pattern. While adjusting an orchid centerpiece, his eyes flicked down to his phone screen. While giving orders to the caterer, his wrist turned just enough for a split-second glance at the display. The third time happened as he handed me my coffee. His eyes locked onto the screen for about half a second before he snapped back to me with a flawless smile. 3 times in less than 10 minutes. People who check the time that often aren't just watching the day pass. They're waiting for a specific milestone. "You've really gone above and beyond these past few weeks, son," I said, testing the waters. "Is everything okay?" His smile was ironclad. "Everything is perfect, Dad. I just want Marcus's wedding to go off without a hitch." "Of course," I said, taking a sip of the coffee. But I saw right through it. There was a tiny micro-expression right before that smile locked into place, a look of calculated anticipation disguised as concern. Julian didn't care about Marcus's wedding. He was counting down to something entirely different. How does a father count down the moments until his own flesh and blood tries to financially ruin him on his other son's wedding day? The same way he counted boardroom votes for 30 years. The same way he read body language across a high-stakes negotiation table. I knew better than anyone that the most dangerous opponent is the one who assumes you aren't paying attention. Through the reflection of an antique brass mirror in the mansion's foyer, I caught Julian looking at his phone for the 4th time. His lips moved slightly, making no sound but tracing the faint shape of numbers. He was running a timeline in his head, one that required constant verification. I knew exactly what deadline he was tracking. I'd known ever since I intercepted copies of the legal documents he thought were deeply buried, tracked the offshore shell accounts he believed were completely anonymous, and watched our wealth manager, Richard Coburn, completely unravel during what was supposed to be a routine trust audit. Julian was waiting for 10 o'clock tonight. What he didn't realize was that I was counting down too. In aerospace, 30 years of engineering teaches you one undeniable truth. Every structural failure gives warning signs before it collapses. People who constantly check the clock are usually waiting on a deadline. And I was waiting for someone who was about to walk through the side garden gate, carrying a telephoto lens and enough hard evidence to bring down a family legacy. I set my coffee down and gave my oldest son a smile. It was the same smile I had used in countless corporate acquisitions, the one that signaled absolute blissful ignorance of the storm ahead. "Let's go check on your brother and sister, see how they're coming along," I suggested. Julian took one last glance at his screen. "Sure thing, Dad," he said. "Let's make today unforgettable." I found Marcus and Clara out on the west terrace facing the Pacific. This was the exact spot where Eleanor used to have her tea every Sunday morning, and for one fleeting, perfect second, I could almost pretend this was just a normal, beautiful wedding day. Marcus was standing in the sunlight wearing his custom tuxedo, 29 years old and radiating the genuine joy of a man about to marry the love of his life. He had met Sarah at a marine conservation seminar. She was a senior forensic accountant at a Big Four firm who had defended his project during a financial audit of an environmental fund. Eleanor would have absolutely adored her. "Dad!" Marcus turned around when he heard my footsteps. "Can you believe this is actually happening? I wish Mom could see this morning." "She does," I said. The air on the terrace smelled of salt water and pine, completely unchanged from the last 30 years. Clara was standing a few feet away. At 34, she carried herself with the sharp, upright posture of the brilliant structural engineer she had become. She lived her life by precise calculations and rigorous stress analysis. But right now, her shoulders were incredibly tense, a posture I'd only ever seen in engineering meetings right before a major structural failure report was delivered. "Morning, Dad," she said, her eyes shifting nervously. "You doing okay, kiddo?" Clara glanced over at Marcus and then lowered her voice. "Dad, a strange transaction popped up on one of my corporate affiliate accounts last week. A massive wire transfer got flagged and blocked by my bank's fraud prevention system. Do you have any idea what that's about?" The question felt like a heavy stone dropped into completely still water. "Tell me everything," I said quietly. "Close to $300,000, Clara said, keeping her hands tucked into the pockets of her bridesmaid dress. "It was routed through an offshore account and then pulled back within 48 hours. A contact of mine at the bank said it looked exactly like someone testing the system, hunting for vulnerabilities in our authorization protocols. I assumed you were just doing some sort of stress test on the trust fund accounts." "I'm not running any tests," I said softly, "but I'm going to look into it." Without even knowing it, Clara had just handed me the final loose thread. Someone had used her security credentials to test the digital guardrails protecting our capital. In the background, 55-year-old Matteo was carrying his heavy camera rig across the terrace. He was a former military cybersecurity specialist who had transitioned into high-end wedding photography after a battle with PTSD. He used to tell me that looking at people's happiest moments through a lens was the only way he could drown out the darkness of the numbers and code he used to fight. He had been documenting our family events for 6 years. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. He gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, the universal signal in cyber defense that a perimeter has been breached. He knew. I knew. Neither of us said a word. "Dad, are you sure you're okay?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with concern. "You look a little pale." "I'm fine, son. Just thinking about your mother." I paused for a moment. "She planted those succulents right along this cliffside the year you were born. You remember how she used to spend every single weekend with her hands covered in dirt, right up until the muscular dystrophy stole her strength and she couldn't kneel anymore?" Marcus's expression softened. "I remember. I must have been 12 or 13 when she'd sit in that wheelchair, directing me exactly which weeds to pull. She had this almost obsessive precision when it came to clearing away dead leaves." "She did," I said, and the two of us shared a quiet smile. A moment later, Matteo appeared right at my elbow, moving swiftly and silently. Stripped of all pleasantries, he spoke in a low, urgent whisper. Arthur, I need 90 seconds of your time right now. I followed him into the blind spot hidden right by the wine cellar entrance beneath the terrace. I was just capturing some candid shots of the estate, he said. About 20 minutes ago, I panned my telephoto lens up to the windows of the Locke Library on the second floor. The look on Julian's face, that wasn't a brother celebrating a wedding. That was a predator cornering its prey. He pulled up his camera and brought up the playback screen. The images showed Julian standing over the antique oak desk, documents laid out in front of him, a pen in his hand. His profile was captured in razor-sharp focus, intense, calculating, and hungry. He was in the middle of signing something. It was a massive document, easily a dozen pages or more. Then he had stepped out into the hallway to take a phone call, leaving the door cracked open for about 30 seconds. I looked at Matteo. You went inside. Old habits, he replied without an ounce of apology. Found this right underneath the desk. It looks like it accidentally slipped out from the rest of the stack. He handed me a crisp, thin piece of paper. Printed across the top header was the title, Petition for Irrevocable Legal Conservatorship over the Ward, Arthur Sterling. My hands instantly went cold. Beneath the heading was a dense wall of legal jargon detailing the immediate forfeiture of cognitive capacity, the mandatory transfer of all trust management, and a total asset takeover. But the detail that truly made my breath catch was an attachment pinned to the top right corner, a formal psychiatric evaluation. The text described a patient suffering from early-onset Alzheimer's disease, accompanied by severe executive dysfunction, manifesting as intense paranoia and memory distortion regarding recent financial decisions. At the very bottom was a signature I recognized instantly, Eris Thorne, M.D. It was dated just 4 days ago. Under California law, once a conservatorship petition backed by a severe medical certification like this is pushed through, the court can issue an emergency intervention order without waiting for a lengthy hearing. Dr. Thorne wasn't just my physician. He was a close personal advisor who had known me for a decade. During Eleanor's final days, he was the one who guided us with a deep empathy I vowed never to forget. Just 3 months ago, he had signed off on a clean bill of health, allowing me to take solo international flights. Now he had signed a document declaring me mentally unfit. Arthur, Matteo's voice sounded muffled like it was coming from a great distance. I read the evaluation again. The words didn't change. The patient exhibits significant degradation in executive functioning. Family members report escalating paranoia regarding wealth management. Immediate intervention is strongly recommended to protect the patient from self-harm and financial exploitation. Family members, plural. Julian wasn't acting alone. How thick did that stack of documents look? I asked. Hard to say exactly, but it was thick enough to cover every asset you own. At least 12 pages, maybe 15. It was a complete, weaponized legal framework designed to strip away every right I had, fast-tracked by a fraudulent medical evaluation. If Julian could force my signature today on a supplementary voluntary handover agreement, or if he had already forged it, he could take this certified file straight to any bank or defense auditing office and immediately seize control. The narrative would be ironclad. I was simply too sick to fight back. Where is he now? I asked. Last I saw, he was heading toward the main ballroom, walking with one of the bridesmaids. I looked at Matteo, and he looked back at me. Neither of us said the doctor's name out loud. My own physician, a medical authority I had trusted for 10 years, had put his name on a document stating I was incapable of running my own life. But we both knew where I had to go next. Down into the quiet dark, cutting through the kitchens and the hallway, lined with framed pictures of Marcus's childhood, straight down into the fortified underground vault, where Julian assumed his secrets were entirely safe. I told Matteo to keep shooting out in the open to maintain appearances, and then I stepped onto the stairs. The sound of my shoes echoed sharply off the granite steps. With every level I descended, the temperature dropped until I reached the very bottom. It was a steady 60 degrees, a climate designed to preserve vintage wine and classified engineering schematics, and, as it turned out, deep betrayal. The air smelled of old oak and aged paper. a mix of the familiar and the chilling. 10 minutes prior, Mateo had pinged an encrypted text to my phone with 4 words and a single digit. Project Apollo, left side. The storage lockers containing the 1969 Apollo lunar module component blueprints were set against the north wall. That was the year we bought this estate. The year I locked away the engineering designs that defined my career. It was the same summer Eleanor had stood out on the cliffs and told me our children would grow up listening to the sound of the ocean. I pulled open the left-hand drawer, sliding my hand behind the third stack of schematics. My fingers brushed against something that didn't feel like heavy draft paper. It was a manila envelope, sealed tightly with heavy electrical tape, and wedged deep into the gap between the drawer and the metal divider. When I tore it open, my hands were entirely steady. 30 years of surviving hostile takeovers and Wall Street short sellers had trained me exactly how to keep breathing when the world was collapsing around me. The document inside was 15 pages long. Final agreement for the restructuring of the Arthur Sterling. Trust and assignment of conservatorship duties. Every page was a minefield of predatory legal clauses, each one more devastating than the last. I stood under the low wattage bulb of the freezing vault, watching my own breath fog into the air as I read. Page 1 configured Julian Sterling as the sole power of attorney and legal conservator, effective immediately upon the activation of the attached medical evaluation. Page 4 expressly authorized the liquidation of all real estate holdings under the trust without prior notice or consent. Page 7 transferred 15 core defense patents held by Sterling Aerospace directly to a specified offshore entity. Page 15 enforced a mandatory arbitration clause requiring all disputes to be settled in Singapore under local jurisdiction. $320 million. 15 vital patents, generating $60 million a year in licensing fees. Prime Silicon Valley commercial real estate. The Lake Tahoe estate where Eleanor and I celebrated our 25th anniversary. All of it designed to change hands with a single signature. My signature. Except I had never signed it. The signature line at the bottom of page 15 was completely blank, waiting silently. Right above the main signature block, however, 2 witness signatures were already filled in. Richard Coburn, my wealth manager, alongside the stamp of a notary public. I didn't recognize the notary's name, but they were undoubtedly part of the arrangement. Under California law, this specific type of voluntary transfer, paired with a medical directive, needed only my signature to close the loop. Julian had gathered every single piece of leverage he needed except my own pen stroke, Doctor. Thorne's fraudulent declaration of mental incompetence, the legal framework to execute the transfer, and the offshore accounts to catch the capital. Given how frequently he was checking the countdown on his phone, he clearly had a plan to secure that final signature today. I carefully folded the documents, slid them back into the envelope, and pulled out my phone. Dr. Iris Thorne answered on the very first ring. His voice sounded like he had aged a decade since the last time we spoke. "Arthur? Iris," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I received your encrypted file. I needed to hear your voice before I made my move." There was a long, heavy silence on the line, followed by a sound that sat somewhere between a sob and a cough. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "My God, Arthur, I am so incredibly sorry." "Tell me exactly what happened." He let out a ragged, trembling breath. 5 weeks ago, he walked straight into my private clinic after hours, acting like he owned the place. He brought a briefcase containing $200,000 in cash and a folder containing my prescription compliance records from 2021. Back then, my own struggle with painkiller dependency had flared up, and I overprescribed heavy opioids to a few Silicon Valley executives. No one was harmed, but I altered the digital logging system to cover my tracks. It was a mistake, a fatal mistake. He threatened to expose you. He said he would file a formal complaint with the Medical Board of California and the DEA, contact the families of those patients, and leak everything to the press. He told me I'd lose the entire practice I built over 40 years, and face federal felony charges. His voice completely broke. Then he pulled out that psychiatric evaluation and told me all I had to do was sign it. Just one signature to validate his observations. That's all it took. And you signed it. I signed it, he said, openly crying now. I didn't take a single dime of the money, Arthur, but I signed it. I've been sick to my stomach every single day since. I can't sleep. I can't look at myself in the mirror. 2 days ago, I sent everything to you. In that encrypted file, you'll find the audio recordings of his threats, photos of the cash, and my own written confession. I received it, I said, and this morning I called the California Medical Board and the DEA to self-report the entire thing. My license has already been suspended pending an official investigation. I'm almost certainly going to lose it permanently, and I could face criminal charges. He paused, taking a shaky breath. But I am ready to testify. Court hearings, sworn depositions, whatever you need, I'll provide it. He used extortion to force my hand on that evaluation, and I have the proof. Dr. Aris Thorne was going to lose his license. He knew it, he accepted it, and he was still choosing to step forward and do the right thing. Stay by your phone, Aris, I told him. Before the night is over, I might need you on a call with the district attorney's office. Whatever you need, Arthur. I know this doesn't erase what I did, but it's a start. Yes, it is, I said, and hung up. I stood there in the vault, holding the file, listening to the faint, muffled sounds of wedding preparations drifting down from 2 floors above. Somewhere up there, Marcus was probably adjusting his bow tie. Sarah was likely laughing at a joke made by one of her bridesmaids, and Julian was probably looking at his watch again, counting down the hours until 10 o'clock tonight. Meanwhile, I was standing in the cold, dim basement, holding a 15-page document proving my oldest son had spent 5 weeks building a massive legal trap to steal 30 years of my life's work. Sometimes the people who can help you the most are the ones who have paid the highest price for their own mistakes. I held on to that thought as I turned and walked back up the stairs, because if Julian was blackmailing our family doctor, he also needed someone with the authority to move the money. The large test wire transfer Clara had mentioned on the terrace earlier this morning was ringing like an alarm bell in my mind. I used the service corridors to get back to the main floor, navigating past the florists and catering staff. Nobody thought twice about an old man carrying a glass of water toward his study. That's the beauty of being underestimated. The private study on the first floor looked exactly as it had when I left it at 6 a.m. My laptop was closed on the mahogany desk. Eleanor's favorite reading armchair sat by the window, and a framed photo of our 3 children at Marcus's PhD graduation stood on the shelf. Everything looked completely normal and peaceful, but it was all a beautifully staged lie. I opened my laptop and logged into my private network monitoring dashboard. This was a system Julian didn't even know existed. I had built it 3 years ago when I started teaching myself cybersecurity, forensics, simply because I was tired of paying consultants to explain what was running on my own company servers. I recognized the origin of the block transaction against Clara's account immediately. It came from the corporate operating account of Sterling Ventures, LLC. My oldest son's name, my oldest son's firm, attempting to establish a paper trail of joint liability through my daughter's engineering account. Clara had been confused and worried about it this morning, entirely in the dark. That meant someone had used her credentials. I dug deeper. The wire transfer authorization showed a requirement for dual signatures. One was from Clara's financial manager, and the other came from an account holder listed as Sterling Family Trust Oversight. Family Trust Oversight. That was a partial joint signing authority I had given Julian 6 years ago to teach him conservative asset management after his first major investment setback. I had intended to revoke it when I retired, but I forgot. He didn't forget. Julian had weaponized an old administrative privilege, combining it with Clara's engineering credentials to forge a money trail pointing directly at his sister. When this scheme inevitably triggered a regulatory audit down the road, and federal authorities began tracking the capital flowing into Singapore, the very first scapegoat they would find was Clara. He wasn't just stealing from me. He was burning his sister's life to the ground to use her as a smokescreen. There was a knock on the study door. Matteo pushed it open without waiting for permission, a habit he'd formed over the last 6 years. "Found something," he said, holding out a tablet. "I've been monitoring the system's backdoor logs from last night. Take a look at this." He tapped a screenshot with a clear timestamp, 11:04 p.m., the study. This exact study. My laptop was open, and Julian was sitting in my chair with his back to the window. His fingers were flying across the keyboard, his face illuminated by the blue glare of the screen. "He was in here while you were asleep," Matteo said quietly. "Covering his tracks," I replied, ensuring the digital breadcrumbs led straight to Clara. Matteo nodded. "He's systematically setting her up." I closed the laptop. "I need to see what else he's planning in real time." "The North Terrace," Matteo said. "There's a direct line of sight from there right into the second-floor library. I can set up the telephoto lens and the lip-reading gear for you right now." 5 minutes later, I was standing on the North Terrace with Matteo's camera, locked onto a heavy tripod. The telephoto lens was zoomed to its absolute maximum. Matteo handed me his iPad, which was running a specialized lip-reading application, a tool he used during cyber reconnaissance operations in the military, when audio surveillance wasn't an option. "Keep it steady on the target, and let the software do the work," he explained. "It's not perfect, but it'll catch the core of the conversation." Through the lens, the second-floor library became razor-sharp. Julian was standing by the window with his arms crossed, his face tight with the intensity of an argument. Standing opposite him was a man I had known for 20 years, Richard Coburn, 58 years old, our family's wealth manager since before Marcus was even born. This was the same man whose eyes had welled with tears when we drafted Eleanor's will, because he respected her just as much as I did. The same man who had clapped me on the shoulder at Marcus's college graduation and told me how blessed I was. Now he was standing in that room, shaking his head in sheer agony as Julian spoke to him. I looked down at the iPad screen. The application was processing Julian's lip movements in real time, translating them into text. Clara has no idea. The funding pipeline looks entirely clean. Richard's response came up slower, the app struggling slightly with his angle. "This is wrong. I can't do this." Julian stepped closer. Even without sound, the shift in his body language was chilling, predatory and deeply threatening. More text appeared on the screen. "You already signed and witnessed those documents. You're an accomplice now. If this goes sideways, you go down with me. Don't forget that audit trail we cleaned up 4 years ago." Richard shook his head again. It wasn't a refusal, it was the look of absolute surrender. How do you hold a man accountable when you can see he's drowning right in front of you? "He doesn't want to be in that room," Matteo muttered, looking over my shoulder. "No," I agreed, "he doesn't." Richard pointed toward the door, a gesture that looked like a demand to leave, but felt entirely desperate. Julian said something else the app failed to catch, then turned on his heel and walked out of the room, leaving Richard completely alone in the frame. For about 10 seconds, Richard stood entirely still. Then he sank heavily into the armchair by the window and buried his face in his hands. "That's not a conspiracy," Matteo said. "That's extortion, which means he can be flipped." I thought back to Richard's history with our family. He had handled Eleanor's estate with incredible care. For 2 decades, he had given me the most honest advice on every major trust decision. On the anniversary of Eleanor's passing last year, he had sent flowers with a handwritten note that simply read, "Still missing her." Whatever leverage Julian held over him, whatever pressure he was applying, Richard Coburn was not a willing participant in this room. "What's his vulnerability?" Matteo asked. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I intend to find out." Through the telephoto lens, I watched Richard stand up, straighten his tie, and walk toward the door with the posture of a man walking toward a firing squad. Whatever Julian was using against him, it was powerful enough to make a man with 20 years of professional integrity sign a document he knew was fraudulent. But every breaking point has a counterweight. You just have to find the right place to apply the pressure. Richard Coburn was the man who drafted Eleanor's will. He was at our 30th anniversary party. Now he was in that room doing something he clearly detested. That made him incredibly valuable. But if Richard was being forced into this, I needed to know exactly what leverage Julian had on him before I could convince him to turn, and I had to clear Clara's name before my daughter became collateral damage in her brother's war. I handed the camera back to Mateo. Dig into everything in Richard Coburn's life over the last 6 months. Financial distress, professional complaints, personal scandals, anything Julian could have weaponized. I'm already on it, Mateo replied. I looked back up at the window. The library was empty now, but the shadow of that conversation still hung heavily in the air. Julian had made a critical mistake. He assumed Richard would stay broken and compliant. He assumed I wouldn't see the exact moment Richard snapped. He was dead wrong on both counts. By 10:30 in the morning, Mateo brought Clara into my private study. My daughter walked in wearing her bridesmaid dress, but her expression was entirely that of a severely sleep-deprived engineer trying to maintain a brave face. "Dad," she said, her eyes darting between me and Mateo, who was standing by the door. Mateo said it was urgent. What's going on? I closed the study door and turned the deadbolt. The sharp click of the lock catching made Clara's shoulders instantly tighten. "Sit down," I said, pointing to the chair across from my desk. She took a seat. Mateo leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms and remaining completely silent. I turned my laptop screen toward Clara, pulling up the wire transfer records I had been analyzing for the last 40 minutes. "This transaction took place 4 days ago, originating from your engineering firm's corporate account," I told her. $300,000 routed into an account controlled by a shell company. Look at the details closely. Clara leaned forward, her eyes scanning the screen. As she processed the specifics, the sender account, routing numbers, and authorization codes, her expression shifted from confusion to intense focus. "I never authorized this." She stopped herself, pulling out her phone and opening her banking app. Her thumb moved rapidly as she logged into her company's back-end infrastructure. She reviewed the transaction history once, twice, and then a third time. "It's not here," she whispered. "My account shows everything is completely normal. The balance is correct. There are no irregular transfers. Nothing flagged. Because he used a master administrative override through the enterprise backend," I explained. "The kind of authorization that won't even show up on your standard user interface unless you pull the raw server logs directly from the bank's main network." Clara's face went entirely pale. Then, as the full weight of what was happening clicked into place, a deep crimson wave of anger flushed up her neck and face. Her hands clamped onto the armrests of the chair, her knuckles turning white. "He used my credentials," she said, her voice tight and forced. "He's setting me up to take the fall for this." "Yes," I said, "he is. How long have you known about this?" 4 weeks, I said. "I've suspected something was wrong for a month, but I only got hard evidence about 3 hours ago." Clara's jaw tightened. I watched her process the information, watching the brain of a structural engineer who had designed skyscrapers on 3 continents start calculating angles and load distribution in a completely different kind of architecture. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because before I dragged anyone else into this, I needed to know exactly how deep the rabbit hole went," I said, "and because I wanted to give him a chance to walk away from the ledge. He's not going to stop." "No," I agreed, "he isn't." Clara stood up, walked to the window, and then paced back to the desk. Her hands opened and clenched, a physical manifestation of anger searching for a direction to explode. I stood up and placed a hand on her shoulder. She stopped pacing. "I need your help," I said calmly. "Not your anger, at least not yet. Can you do that?" When Clara was 10 years old, I taught her that unchanneled anger is just noise. 24 years later, she still remembered. She stared at me for a long, heavy second. Then she gave a sharp, clean nod. "What do you need?" I pointed back to the chair and she sat down. I took my seat opposite her. "First, I need you to access the highest level of administrative logs for your company's systems. Not the banking app, but the actual server access history. I need a record of every unauthorized login over the past 8 weeks. Timestamps, IP addresses, everything." "I can do that," Clara said. "My IT director can pull it within an hour." "Do it yourself," I said. "Don't involve anyone else just yet. Do you have root access to the back end?" "Yes." "Good. Second, I need you to take control of the multimedia and audio-visual systems for the main ballroom today. the projectors, the audio feeds, everything. I assume Julian has the vendor's contact information. He does. He's been coordinating with the AV company all week, Clara confirmed. I can call them and tell them there's a change in the presentation workflow. They'll give me admin credentials. I'm listed as the secondary contact on the contract. Call them before noon, I said. Tell them the estate owner has authorized a schedule change. I'll email a written confirmation to their contact address right now. I typed out 3 lines on my phone. Estate owner authorized. Attached my digital signature along with my direct verification number, and hit send before Clara even dialed. Clara pulled out her phone and jotted down a memo. Her hands were perfectly steady now. The anger had been channeled into something useful. Anything else? Yes. When you pull those corporate access logs, I need you to track every single financial transaction that touched your accounts over the last 60 days. Not just that $300,000 test amount. Everything. If Julian used your credentials once, he's likely used them multiple times. Looking for a pattern, Clara said. Exactly. She nodded. What else aren't you telling me? I hesitated for a brief moment. This isn't just about stealing money. He has framed you as the financial architect of the entire scheme. If this plan gets exposed before we can document his actions, the evidence trail leads straight to your name. That was Julian's calculation. He assumed I would sacrifice one child to protect the other. Clara's face remained completely stoic as she absorbed the impact of that statement. How bad are the consequences? Bad enough that you'd need a very high-end white-collar defense attorney, and you'd likely lose your engineering license during the investigation. Marcus doesn't know yet, right? She asked. He won't know, not today. Unless it becomes absolutely unavoidable, we are not letting him find out at his own wedding. Clara glanced over at Matteo, then back at me. You have a plan. I'm building it, I said, step by step. We move tonight, during the reception toast, right after the ceremony. Julian is counting down to a 10 p.m. deadline. I intend to make sure he never reaches it. Clara stood up. I'll have the logs within 2 hours. Multimedia control before noon. Anything else? I looked at my 34-year-old daughter, carrying the weight of her brother's betrayal, yet acting as precise as if she were calculating the load tolerance of a 50-story building. You haven't even asked me what happens after tonight, I remarked. You'll tell me when I need to know, Clara said. Right now, you need data and control. I can provide both. She didn't ask me how long I'd been keeping this from her, or why I hadn't spoken up sooner. She just asked, What do you need? That was Clara. She had always been the rock of this family. I just hadn't told her that often enough. Matteo unlocked the door, and Clara walked out without looking back, already working on her phone. I sat back down at the desk and pulled the small black leather notebook from my vest pocket. 28 days of entries. 28 days of watching my oldest son build a massive conspiracy. But resting right beneath that notebook, pressed against my heart, was the envelope I'd been carrying since morning. Written on the outside was Eleanor's handwriting. Open this only when you know exactly what needs to be done. Ever since the vault, ever since Dr. Aris Thorne's confession, and ever since seeing Clara's name on those wire transfers, I knew exactly what needed to be done. What I needed to understand next was just how far this conspiracy reached, and that meant opening the envelope I had been trying to avoid. By 10:45, the 3 of us reassembled in the study with the door locked tight. Outside, the wedding preparations continued unabated, like 2 parallel universes. In our universe, we were building a completely different kind of engineering structure. Clara placed her laptop on the desk next to Matteo's camera and my documents. The room felt small, charged with a singular purpose. The Enterprise server access logs, Clara said, pulling up a detailed spreadsheet. I ran the data for the last 90 days. Look at the pattern. Highlighted rows showed 17 separate instances of access to the master trust directory. All of them occurred after hours, all between midnight and 3 a.m., and all validated using Clara's administrative credentials. 17 times! Clara's voice was taut. He accessed the trust files 17 times. Every single entry was unauthorized, and he was incredibly careful. Never on the same day, never at predictable intervals. Someone coached him on how to bypass the automated alarm thresholds. What exactly was he accessing? I asked. Patent assignment documentation, real estate transfer agreements, trust amendment workflow charts. She scrolled through the logs. He was mapping the architecture, learning exactly which files needed to be modified and in what order to execute a clean asset transfer. Matteo placed his phone on the desk, screen up. I reached out to a contact who still covers white-collar crime. He ran a few queries. Apparently, there's been talk inside Richard Coburn's law firm for the past 2 months. Junior associates working late hours, preparing unusual documentation for a client who insisted on meeting only after hours. 8 weeks, I said. At least, Matteo confirmed. This wasn't a sudden impulse. The conservatorship transfer agreement was professionally drafted, heavily reviewed, and revised multiple times. We're looking at a 2-month operation involving legal counsel, financial planning, and systematic documentation theft. An 8-week plan deserved an equal amount of response time, but I had given myself only 4 hours. The evening was closing in whether I was ready or not. I picked up my phone. I'm calling Diane Hughes. Diane Hughes was my personal attorney based out of Chicago. At 55, she was sharp enough to have made senior partner before she turned 40. I had retained her 3 years ago specifically for her expertise in estate defense and elder financial abuse cases. Eleanor had insisted on it back then, saying we needed someone who understood exactly how families could tear each other apart over money. I put her on speaker. Diane answered on the second ring. Arthur Sterling, she said, recognizing the line. This is an unexpected surprise. Is everything all right? No, I said. We have a situation, financial exploitation, wire fraud, identity theft. I'm going to need you, potentially before 10 p.m. tonight. There was a distinct pause. When Diane spoke again, her tone shifted instantly from casual pleasantry to tactical execution. Are you safe right now? I am, I said. But my son has spent 8 weeks manufacturing a legal conservatorship takeover. We have evidence of unauthorized system access, a falsified psychiatric evaluation, and fraudulent wire transfers utilizing my daughter's corporate credentials. What kind of exposure are we talking about? Everything, I told the phone. He intends to take the entire trust tonight. Arthur, Diane said, her voice dropping into a firm, commanding rhythm. I want you to listen to me very carefully. Do not sign anything. Do not verbally agree to anything. If he approaches you with documents, take a picture and send them to me immediately. I already have them, I said. Good. I'm clearing my schedule. Starting at 6 p.m. Pacific time, I will be completely at your disposal. You have my emergency line. I do. Arthur, if things spiral out of control, or if he moves faster than expected, dial 911 first, then call me. Understood? Understood. She hung up. Matteo looked at me from across the desk. You have a good lawyer. Eleanor insisted on retaining her, I said, closing Clara's laptop. What else do we need before tonight? There's one more thing I need to verify, I said, standing up. Give me 15 minutes. I left them in the study and walked upstairs to the master suite. The wedding chaos had spilled into almost every corner of the house, but this room remained entirely untouched. It was my private sanctuary, and it had been for the last 2 years. The wall safe was hidden behind Eleanor's portrait, painted for our 25th anniversary, back when she still looked like herself, long before the illness began hollowly consuming her from the within. I slid the frame aside, punched in the code, our wedding anniversary. He swung open the heavy steel door. Inside sat my operating manuals, some cash, Eleanor's jewelry, and that sealed manila envelope bearing her distinct handwriting, to be opened only if the family faces absolute ruin. I tore open the seal and pulled out 4 handwritten pages. The penmanship was the familiar script I had known for 38 years, dated 3 months before she passed, back when she could still hold a pen without a tremor. Arthur, if you are reading this, it means my worst fears have come true. Last week, Julian came to visit me at the clinic privately. He asked very specific questions about the execution structure of the trust, who held signing authority. What would happen if you were declared incapacitated, and whether his siblings could access funds independently. I didn't tell him anything useful, but the questions themselves spoke volumes. I sat down on the edge of the mattress. Our son loves us, Arthur, but he loves an uncontrollable gamble even more. I watched him grow up. He needs to dominate every variable, and he cannot tolerate uncertainty. It makes him brilliant in venture capital, but the moment he faces a real loss, he becomes incredibly dangerous. Look after Clara and Marcus. The account information below is strictly for them. Julian has no idea it exists. On the final page, clipped to the paper, was a small note containing a routing number, account codes, and access credentials for a banking entity in the Cayman Islands. $45 million, established in Eleanor's name 2 years before her passing, designated as an irrevocable trust solely for Clara and Marcus. She had known all along. Buried deep for 2 years, Eleanor was still the most prepared person in this house. I folded the letter, slipping it into my vest pocket next to where my chest ached the most. Eleanor always knew exactly where to aim an arrow when she needed me to listen. Next, I went to find Sarah. If Eleanor's suspicions about Julian had run deep enough to hide millions behind his back, I needed to know what my future daughter-in-law had quietly picked up on her radar. The bridal suite was on the second floor, right down the hallway from where this whole mess started, the library. I gave the door a soft knock, and Sarah opened it, still holding her veil. "Arthur," she said, a flash of surprise crossing her face. At 28, Marcus's bride carried the distinct, quiet confidence of a forensic accountant who had gone toe-to-toe with corporate executives twice her age and won. She was sharp enough to protect clients in a boardroom, yet gentle enough to make a heartbroken Marcus laugh again in an emergency room. "I need a word with you," I said, privately. She glanced back into the suite where her bridesmaids were busy arranging flowers and champagne flutes, then stepped out into the hallway, pulling the doors shut behind her. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Marcus is perfectly fine," I said, "but I need to ask you something." Before I could even frame the question, she beat me to it. "You received my file, didn't you?" The hallway went completely silent. "I did," I said carefully, "but before I respond, I need to know who else is watching." Sarah's shoulders dropped slightly, a wave of relief mixing with something much heavier. "I wasn't sure if it actually reached you, or if you thought I was overstepping my bounds. Tell me exactly what you saw." She checked both ends of the hallway, ensuring we were entirely alone. 3 weeks ago, I was working late on a corporate merger ledger for my firm. Around 2 a.m., my laptop flagged a security alert. Someone on our home network was accessing an external high-clearance portal. I initially thought it was a cyber breach, so I traced the connection. It was Julian. He was using his credentials as a senior partner at his VC firm to log into Sterling Aerospace's corporate portal, specifically digging through a directory marked Trust and Estates. I watched him for about 10 minutes. He downloaded at least 15 restricted files. "How are you on the same network?" "Marcus and I have been staying in the guest wing of his place in Palo Alto for the past month, while waiting for our new condo to close," Sarah explained. "Same Wi-Fi network. I saw everything." She was only 28, about to marry into a family that was quietly tearing itself apart at the seams, and she had carried that secret entirely alone for 3 weeks. "Why didn't you tell Marcus?" I asked. "Because it was the eve of his wedding," she said simply, "and because I couldn't verify the exact intent of what he was doing, only that he was doing something highly irregular at 2 o'clock in the morning. I took screenshots, encrypted the file, and sent it to you anonymously. I figured you either already knew or you'd know how to investigate it." "I knew something was wrong," I said, "but I didn't know you were watching. I'm sorry you had to carry that weight." "I'm marrying into this family, Arthur," Sarah said. "That means protecting it, even if it's from the inside." Marcus's judgment was better than he even knew. Sarah had the backbone required to defend a legacy she hadn't even officially joined yet. "Before I sent you that email," Sarah continued, "I uncovered something else. Do you want to see it?" "Yes." She pushed the door to the bridal suite open, gesturing for me to step inside. The bridesmaids had moved into the adjoining vanity room, their voices and laughter muffled behind a closed door. Sarah's laptop sat open on the vanity table, surrounded by makeup brushes and hairspray. She navigated through a secure directory and pulled up an email thread. "I cloned the files he downloaded before I sent the alert to you," Sarah explained. Most of it was trust documentation, amendments, signing authority chains. But this one, she opened an email dated just 4 days ago. The header read, To Lion City, Defense Holdings, Singapore. From Julian Sterling. Subject, Restructuring/Patent Acquisition Opportunity. I read the body of the text once, then read it again. The conservatorship transfer documentation is scheduled for execution on Monday morning. 15 core defense patents are immediately available for acquisition at 40% below current market valuation. Preference for offshore cash settlement. Please confirm intent and proposed terms by Sunday evening. Attached was a spreadsheet detailing every single patent I had engineered over my career in aerospace. Every composite material I had spent 30 years developing and licensing to the military. Every piece of intellectual property that generated our family's capital. Every single one of them was marked down for a fire sale. He's not just trying to steal the money, I whispered. No, Sarah agreed. He's dismantling your entire empire and selling it for scrap. This wasn't just a theft. It was an extraction, a liquidation, a total erasure offered to the highest foreign bidder. I thought about the endless nights spent in the garage drafting the first aerodynamic schematics, about the pilots who relied on our components to keep them safe in the air. Julian had put it all on the chopping block for strangers in Singapore who would strip it down for immediate profit and maximum extraction. The response came in yesterday, Sarah said, scrolling down the screen. Lion City Defense confirmed intent. They've offered $250 million for the entire patent portfolio, cash settlement within 72 hours of the verified transfer. $250 million, half of what the actual market valuation was worth, which was easily $500 million, a clearance sale to offshore investors who would immediately resell or break up the portfolio. Everything I built, everything I intended to leave for Marcus and Clara, Julian had sold it down the river to vultures waiting to pick it apart. Thank you for showing me this, Sarah, I said. Sarah closed the laptop. I'm sorry I didn't come to you directly 3 weeks ago. You did exactly the right thing, I told her. The encrypted file gave me time to verify everything without tipping him off. If you had confronted him openly, he would have covered his tracks. What are you going to do now? Stop him, I said simply. Sarah looked at me for a long moment. Marcus doesn't know yet, right? Not yet. And if I can help it, he won't know until the ceremony is completely finished. Good, she said. Let him have this morning. He deserves it. I thanked Sarah and quietly pulled the door shut behind me. I no longer harbored any illusions about my oldest son. If he was going to sell my life's work overseas, I needed to know what cards I had left to play legally, and that meant calling the one person who could give me those answers. By noon, the North Garden was entirely deserted. The catering staff was focused on setting up the lunch service on the south lawn. I walked behind the towering boxwood hedges, ensuring no one could overhear, and dialed Diane Hughes. She picked up on the very first ring. Arthur, what do you have? The entire picture, I said. Standing behind the dense wall of greenery, with the phone pressed tight to my ear, I laid out the puzzle pieces of the conspiracy one by one. The fraudulent psychiatric evaluation, the blackmailed Dr. Thorne, the wire transfers utilizing Clara's forged signature, the coerced Richard Coburn, and the $250 million fire sale agreement to Singapore. Diane listened without interrupting once. When I finished, the silence on the line lasted for a full 5 seconds. How much time do we have left before his deadline? She asked. 10 p.m. That leaves us 10 hours, I replied. He needs my signature on the voluntary handover paperwork to execute any of this. According to the document Mateo pulled, it requires my voluntary consent to activate. Then here is exactly what you need to understand, Arthur, Diane said, her tone dropping into the bone-chilling, clinical rhythm she reserved for high-stakes depositions. Under the California Probate Code, a voluntary conservatorship assignment becomes effective the very second you sign it. If you put pen to paper tonight, he can walk into any financial institution tomorrow morning and begin liquidating your life's work. My grip tightened on the receiver. But here's the catch, Diane continued. He cannot force you into this through the court system within 24 hours. An involuntary petition requires a formal hearing. Ex parte emergency orders are incredibly difficult to secure, especially on a Saturday night. By 10 p.m., he would have to prove to a judge that you are in imminent physical danger, which is a complete impossibility with the fabricated evidence he currently holds. So his entire strategy hinges completely on manipulating or forcing me into a voluntary signature. Exactly. Which means his leverage is entirely psychological, not legal. He will try to threaten you, corner you, and likely weaponize that medical evaluation to break your resolve. But legally, he is completely powerless unless you yield. I thought about the manila envelope hidden deep in the vault, Julian's constant countdowns, and the calculated precision of using Marcus's wedding as a smokescreen. "Let him come to you," Diane said, pausing to let every word land. "Do not confront him yet. Do not show your hand. Let him approach you in that room, and let him voice those threats himself. If you can record that interaction, elder financial exploitation, attempted grand larceny, conspiracy to defraud, I can file an immediate motion to vacate that assignment and have him in handcuffs before sunrise." 30 years of surviving hostile corporate takeovers had taught me one fundamental truth. The party showing urgency in a negotiation is always the one destined to lose. "There's one more piece to this puzzle," Diane added. "I ran a background check on that Singapore defense entity. Those dark pool cross-border wire transfers operate on strict windows that close at midnight Pacific time on Sunday. If he misses that window, his deal with Singapore completely collapses. He will lose his buyer, and with it, his only exit strategy to cover his $65 million leverage deficit. That's why it has to be tonight. He is cornered. He needs my signature," I said slowly, "but I don't have to give it to him." "Now you're thinking like a lawyer," Diane said. "I'm already drafting an immediate restructuring of the trust, naming Clara and Marcus as the sole beneficiaries, managed by an independent trustee. I'll have a digital notary on standby. The moment he overplays his hand, call me, and we will execute the new framework, cutting Julian out of the family legacy permanently. Understood?" "Understood. Arthur, when he approaches you tonight with that agreement, I need you to stay entirely calm. Do not overreact. Do not show anger. Just refuse to sign, and let him show you exactly how far he is willing to go. The more desperate he gets, the more damning our evidence becomes." "I can do that," I promised. "I know you can. Call me the second you need me." She disconnected. Standing there in the quiet of the north garden, the distant sounds of wedding setup drifted through the hedges. Musicians tuning their strings, caterers arranging silver. The beautiful, ordinary sounds of a celebration were about to become the backdrop for something incredibly dark. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text from Clara. The security feed for the second-floor library was cut at 6 a.m. Admin credentials from Richard's tablet were used to override it. Mateo and I are handling it. I read the message twice. Julian had mapped out the estate's security infrastructure well in advance. He had used Richard's credentials to blind the library hours before anyone else had even opened their eyes. He thought he had secured a perfect blind spot. He believed that the room where he intended to corner me tonight would be an isolated island, dark, unmonitored, and completely devoid of witnesses. I texted back, "What's the countermove?" Claire's reply came 30 seconds later. "Mateo is deploying an off-grid micro-lens array right now. Independent power and storage. We will own the raw footage." I navigated back inside through the service entrance and made my way up to the second floor. The security monitoring hub was tucked away at the end of the east corridor, a cramped room lined with displays broadcasting various feeds from around the property. Mateo and Clara were already inside. Mateo held a device barely larger than a shirt button, while Clara cross-referenced data on her laptop. "Show me," I said. Mateo held up the miniature camera. "Encrypted wireless transmission, independent battery loop. I'm nesting it directly into the crown molding in the far corner of the library. It'll capture the entire room, high-definition video, and directional audio." "Is the chain of custody legally sound?" I asked. "That's on you," Clara said, turning the laptop screen toward me. "Property owner consent waiver. If you sign this digital authorization allowing active surveillance on your own primary estate, We can feed the live telemetry straight to the Monterey Police Department without waiting on a warrant. Under California law, explicit owner consent provides an ironclad baseline. I skimmed the document. It was precise and unambiguous. Arthur Sterling, as sole title holder of the estate, hereby authorizes audio and video surveillance of the second-floor library to deter and document potential criminal activity. I used the trackpad to log my digital signature. Routing to Diane now, Clara said, hitting the enter key. She'll transmit it directly to the local precinct along with a formal monitoring request. Mateo slid the micro camera into his vest pocket. I'll have it deployed in 10 minutes. By tonight, that library is going to be the most thoroughly documented room in the state of California. Julian had severed the main security feed, believing he was stepping into the shadows. Instead, he was walking directly into a beautifully engineered legal trap. One more thing, Mateo said, pulling up a capture on his camera roll. I was reviewing some of my candid test shots from earlier this morning. You need to see who was meticulously inspecting the signing tables at 7:15. He zoomed in on a high-resolution image. Standing right beside the reception desk where the legal signings and notary work were scheduled to take place tonight was a woman I had known for about 11 months. Her posture was entirely telling, not casual, not curious, but completely focused on a tactical layout. It was Sylvia, the woman Julian had brought as his guest, ostensibly a luxury lifestyle designer. But in the photo, her hand was lightly touching the pens on the desk to test their alignment, her eyes scanning the ceiling for security blind spots. She looked like a general surveying a battlefield. I zoomed closer. Sylvia's expression was cold, intense, and completely stripped of the bright social warmth she usually displayed at family gatherings. This was a liquidator assessing an asset. It instantly reminded me of the corporate turnaround specialists I used to encounter during my early years in Silicon Valley, the ruthless operators brought in by creditors to dismantle failing firms and restructure distressed debt. Sylvia wasn't a lifestyle designer. She was the enforcer sent by Julian's backers. The entire picture clicked into place: the highly professional drafting of the conservatorship, the complex offshore shell network, the systematic masking of the wire transfers. This wasn't a desperate, last-minute gamble put together by Julian. This was Sylvia applying her corporate restructuring expertise to a hostile family takeover, designed to extract the absolute maximum value from our trust. Sylvia had smiled and complimented my suit just a few hours ago, and now she was inspecting the signing desk like an executioner, verifying a scaffold. I turned to Mateo. Keep a lens on her for the rest of the day. Do not give her any reason to suspect we're paying attention. Copy that, he replied. I slipped my phone back into my vest and walked up to the third-floor guest suite where the bridal party was getting ready. The double doors were slightly ajar. Marcus wasn't inside. He was likely down on the lawn with Sarah, but Clara was sitting on the edge of an armchair, her posture rigid, like someone holding in a breath for far too long. "Clara," I said softly, stepping into the room. She looked up, her face pale and exhausted. "Can we talk for a second?" she asked. "That's exactly why I'm here." I closed the door behind me and took the chair opposite her. For about 10 seconds, neither of us said a word. "There's something I didn't tell you this morning," Clara finally confessed, her voice dropping. "Something about Julian." "Tell me now." She took a slow, heavy breath. 4 months ago, he approached me privately. He told me he was facing a temporary cash flow crunch on a short-term bridge loan and just needed a buffer until his next quarterly venture distributions cleared. He asked me for a personal loan. "How much?" $500,000, Clara whispered. "Every cent of liquidity I've built up from my engineering firm over the last 10 years. I kept my expression entirely neutral. "And you lent it to him." "He's my brother," she said, as if that explained everything, and perhaps it did. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to trigger a massive family rift. He promised it would be repaid within 60 days, 90 at the absolute maximum. He signed a promissory note, but then he completely defaulted. When I pressed him after the 3-month mark, he stopped taking my calls. When he did answer, he just said the liquidation took a worse turn than expected, and he needed more time. Eventually, he went completely silent." She looked straight at me. That's why I froze when you showed me those wire logs this morning. He had already taken everything I built on my own, and then he turned around and used my name to steal even more. I reached over and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Clara, it was never your burden to protect him from the consequences of his own choices. I should have made that clear to you a long time ago. You're making it clear now, she said. That's what matters. But my mind was already running the engineering metrics on the math. Clara's 500,000, the 200,000 used to blackmail our family physician, the $250 million clearance sale to Singapore. The underlying structure was entirely clear. Julian was drowning under a massive $65 million leveraged debt deficit, and the creditors, the people Sylvia truly represented, were holding a knife to his throat, ready to file a ruinous lawsuit first thing Monday morning. I uncovered that buried detail from the forensic financial records Sarah had sent over. The loan documents, the margin calls, the collapsed leverage positions. Julian had been playing with money he didn't have, and he lost the bet. When the bill came due, his eyes turned toward the only asset large enough to fill the void, the family trust. $65 million is a dark, bottomless hole. It's the kind of depth where you stop looking for a ladder and start calculating how many people you can drag down to cushion your fall. He's cornered, I said. Desperate people make horrific choices. Does it excuse it? Not for a second. But it explains everything. Clara stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where guests were beginning to arrive for the 2:00 ceremony. What are you going to do, Dad? What needs to be done? I replied. She turned around to face me. You've known about this longer than just this morning, haven't you? I met her gaze. 4 weeks. Why didn't you stop him sooner? Because I wanted to be wrong, I said simply. I wanted to give him the chance to make a different choice. But he didn't. No, I agreed, he didn't. Clara nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it. What do you need from me? Keep doing exactly what you're doing. The server access logs, the multimedia controls, the surveillance, the coordination. And Clara, when this is over, that $500,000 is going back into your account first, before anything else. I don't even care about the money anymore, she said. I know you don't, but you're getting it back. I left the groom's suite and walked downstairs. The ceremony was less than an hour away. Guests were steadily filtering in. The musicians were warming up. To the outside world, everything looked absolutely flawless. He had taken his sister's life savings. He had forged her signature. And even that wasn't enough. 65 million is an abyss so deep that I realized for the first time there was never a scenario where Julian was going to walk up to me and ask for help. He had calculated that a robbery is always faster than a plea. If he figured stealing was quicker than asking, I was about to show him what I'd been calculating while he was busy planning his heist. At 1:45, I called the three of them back into my study and locked the door. It was time for them to know the truth I had been keeping to myself for a month, and exactly why I had waited. Clara and Mateo stood near the desk. On my laptop screen, Sarah was patched in via a secure video link from the bridal suite, her wedding dress just visible in the background. What's really going on here? Clara asked. The truth, I said, the whole truth. I sat down in Eleanor's favorite reading chair. This was the exact spot where she used to help me review defense contracts, telling me when I was being too cautious or not bold enough. Even after 2 years, the leather still carried a faint trace of her perfume. 4 weeks ago, I began, I received an alert from a financial intelligence source I've kept since retirement. Julian was facing a catastrophic margin call. His leveraged positions had collapsed, and he had taken out high-interest loans using his VC partnership status as collateral. His total personal exposure is $65 million. The room went entirely still. Clara didn't even breathe. I retained Diane Hughes that exact same day, I continued, not to defend against what might happen, but to prepare for what I knew would happen. I spent the last 4 weeks building the counter-strategy you are executing today. You knew the whole time, Clara whispered. All this time you let us think you were completely unprotected. I wanted to be wrong about him, I said, but I made sure I was ready for the reality that I was right. Mateo leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. What's the counter-strategy? Forensics first. Before I make a single move, I need the entire scope of the conspiracy. Every unauthorized access point, every forged signature, every single accomplice. If I had confronted Julian 4 weeks ago with partial information, he would have just adapted his plan, destroyed the evidence, and waited for the smoke to clear to try again. So I watched, I documented, and I gave him countless opportunities to make a different choice. What choice? Sarah asked through the screen. I pulled up a file on the computer and turned the screen so they could all see it. It was a banking statement for a high-value offshore account. Your mother's legacy account, I said, looking at Clara. Eleanor set this up years ago for a fatal family crisis. Since she passed, it hasn't been touched. The current balance is $68 million. Clara stared at the display. I have the capital, I said quietly. 68 million, completely liquid. If Julian had come to me, if at any point in the last 4 weeks he had walked into this room and said, Dad, I'm in trouble. I made a fatal mistake. I need help. I would have cleared every single cent of his debt without a second thought. No questions asked, no judgment, just help. Eleanor always said, the hardest gift to give your children is the space to fail on their own terms. I gave Julian 4 weeks of space, and he spent every single second of it sharpening the knife he intends to use on me tonight. He chose to steal instead of asking, Clara said, her voice dropping. Yes. Why? Sarah asked from the monitor. If you were willing to bail him out, if the money was right there, why didn't he just open his mouth? Because asking for help means admitting failure, I said. Asking means showing vulnerability. Asking means accepting that he isn't the flawless success story he spent 38 years trying to prove he is to everyone. Stealing allows him to maintain the illusion. If he pulls it off, no one ever knows he failed. And if he gets caught, I paused. He calculated that he wouldn't get caught. Mateo spoke up for the first time. When did you know for sure he wasn't going to stop? 2 weeks ago, I said, when he went to Clara, drained her savings, and immediately defaulted. Right then I knew this wasn't a desperate man looking for an exit. This was cold calculation. He was stress testing how much value he could extract from his own family before pulling the final trigger. Clara sank heavily into the chair across from me. I should have told you when he asked for the money. You did what family does, I told her. You trusted him. That wasn't a mistake, kiddo. That's the fundamental difference between you and him. What now? She asked. Now we wait, I said. The ceremony starts in 45 minutes. Julian is going to play the perfect older brother out there. Sylvia and Richard are going to play the loyal friends. And between now and 10 p.m. tonight, Julian will make his final move. He'll try to use that medical evaluation as leverage to force my hand on the voluntary handover agreement. And when he does? Sarah asked. Mateo's lenses will document every single word. Diane is on standby with the trust restructuring paperwork, and I will give Julian one absolute final opportunity to walk away. If he refuses, I let the sentence hang. Then the choice is out of his hands. The grandfather clock in the study chimed 2:15. There were 45 minutes left before Marcus was scheduled to say his vows, and I still didn't know if his older brother would be standing at the altar or leaving in handcuffs by midnight. Does Marcus know any of this? Sarah asked. No, I said, and unless it becomes a matter of immediate safety, he won't. Today is his wedding. He deserves this day. He has a right to know his brother is trying to incinerate this family, Clara countered. He will know, I said calmly. By midnight, everyone will know, but not before he says his vows, not before he gets the perfect moment he earned. On the screen, Sarah gave a firm nod. I'll keep him focused on the ceremony. He won't suspect a thing. Thank you, I said. Clara stood up, smoothing down her dress. What do you need us to do for the next 45 minutes? Stay visible. Act completely natural. Clara, go be a bridesmaid. Mateo, cover this ceremony like it's the most critical assignment of your career. Sarah, go be the stunning bride Marcus chose. And all of you. I looked at each of them in turn. Remember that whatever happens tonight, we gave him every possible exit ramp. They filed out of the room one by one. Sarah's video feed cut to black. The study fell into complete silence. Sitting in Eleanor's chair, I pulled out Her letter again. The one warning me about our oldest son. The question was never whether Julian would try something. It was whether he would ever stop. For the past 8 weeks, he had been giving his answer every single day. Now it was my turn to give mine. The ceremony starting in 45 minutes would be the stage where all the answers, his and mine, would play out in front of 200 unsuspecting guests. At 3 o'clock sharp, the string quartet struck the first note, and 200 guests stood up in unison. 2 entirely different ceremonies began at the exact same moment. The East Garden looked like the exact wedding Eleanor had always envisioned. White roses climbed the arches, baby's breath nestled in crystal vases beside every row of white wooden chairs, and the Pacific Ocean framed the horizon in a brilliant canvas of gray and blue. 200 elegantly dressed guests stood, turned toward the garden entrance, waiting for Sarah to appear. I stood at the altar right next to Marcus, watching my youngest son try his best to stop playing with his cufflinks. He looked identical to how I felt on my own wedding day, that unique mixture of terror and absolute gratitude that hits you right before your life changes forever. "You doing okay?" I whispered. "Absolutely not," Marcus murmured back, but his smile was so wide it looked like his face might split. Clara stood on the opposite side of Marcus, completely poised and quiet in her bridesmaid dress. Matteo moved seamlessly through the crowd, capturing candid frames through his lens. The ocean breeze was crisp, guests were smiling, and a few people were already wiping away tears. The music shifted. Everyone turned. Sarah appeared at the edge of the garden, her gown catching the afternoon sun as she walked arm in arm with her father. Marcus let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. I placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, and I felt him lock in. As she walked down the white wooden aisle, I watched 200 people bear witness to the girl Marcus had fallen for. Brilliant, kind, and resilient enough to love a man who brought the heavy burden of global conservation home with him every single day. Eleanor would have been utterly captivated by this moment, the vast ocean behind them, the roses framing the altar, and the pure, terrified ecstasy in Marcus's eyes. But from where I stood at the altar, I also had a clear, unobstructed view of the front row. Julian sat 3 seats in from the aisle, looking sharp and polished in his custom suit. His smile was flawless, projecting the exact image of a proud older brother that the crowd expected. But his eyes were constantly tracking. They flicked sharply to the right, landing on Richard Coburn 2 seats over. Richard's gaze was locked entirely on his own shoes, his knuckles white as he gripped his knees, the posture of a man forcing himself not to sprint out of the venue. Right next to Richard, Sylvia sat perfectly upright, her hands folded primly in her lap, but the index finger of her right hand was tapping rhythmically against the back of her left. 1, 2, 3, 4. A cadence that looked like nervous energy but was actually pure, calculated timing, counting down the clock, counting the hours until they could pull the net tight. The officiant began to speak. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." 2 violently conflicting realities overlapped in the exact same sacred space. In one layer, a family was celebrating a lifetime of devotion. Marcus and Sarah were exchanging heartfelt vows. Guests were dabbing their eyes, and the horizon offered a picture-perfect backdrop. In the other layer, an economic execution was sprinting toward a midnight deadline. Julian was monitoring his targets. Richard was fighting back visible panic, and Sylvia was using her index finger to calculate exactly how many hours were left before they could corner me in the library and force my hand onto those forged documents. "I, Marcus, take you, Sarah, to be my wife." My youngest son's voice was remarkably clear and strong, even as tears streamed down his face. 2 rows back, Julian's smile remained absolutely seamless, but his eyes flicked down to his phone once more. It was a quick, highly practiced time check. 7 hours until 10 p.m. "I promise to love you," Sarah said, holding Marcus's hands firmly, "to stand by you, to build our life together, from this day forward, as long as we both shall live." I felt a sharp tightness in my throat. This was real. This was entirely pure. Marcus had found someone who would protect him the exact same way Eleanor used to protect me. The kind of partner who, upon discovering his older brother logging into restricted trust files at 2 in the morning, would immediately route an encrypted warning to her future father-in-law. The officiant smiled warmly at the couple. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Marcus, you may kiss your bride. Marcus kissed Sarah as if they were the only two people left on earth. The 200 guests erupted into applause and cheers. The rapid click of Mateo's camera shutter sounded like a sudden downpour against the stone. Clara clapped, a massive, genuine smile breaking across her face. I applauded along with everyone else, watching my son and his new wife turn to face the crowd, both of them absolutely radiant. Julian stood up with the rest of the guests, clapping, smiling, and tossing rose petals as Marcus and Sarah made their way back down the aisle. To anyone watching, he was the perfect older brother, the ultimate family man, the ideal wedding guest. But the exact moment Marcus and Sarah cleared his row, Julian's hand dropped back to his side, his thumb sliding effortlessly across his phone display. Another quick check, another calculation. Beside him, Sylvia leaned in closer to whisper something to Richard, and I watched whatever little color was left in Richard's face completely drain away. Devotion and betrayal, vows and conspiracies, joy and terror, all of it was compressed into a 60-foot stretch of sacred ground, separated by nothing more than 2 rows of white wooden chairs. The ceremony concluded, and the crowd began migrating toward the cocktail terrace. Marcus and Sarah followed the photography team for their formal portraits. Clara caught my eye across the moving crowd and gave me a tiny single nod. Everything was moving precisely according to plan. Both operations, the wedding and the countermove, were running on perfectly parallel tracks. Once the crowd dispersed, I stood by the altar for a moment, looking at the empty chairs and the scattered petals on the grass. The string quartet had transitioned into light jazz. Servers appeared with silver trays of champagne. The air filled with laughter and overlapping conversations. It was normal, beautiful, exactly what a wedding was supposed to feel like, except for the fact that during that 30-minute ceremony, I had watched Julian check his clock 4 separate times. I had watched Richard grip his knees so hard it looked like he might break his own fingers. And I had watched Sylvia tap out the rhythm of their countdown like a conductor leading a silent orchestra. Marcus had said, "I do," with a smile I will carry to my grave. 2 rows behind him, his brother was calculating the exact moment to destroy me, and I stood right between them, holding both truths at the same time. But that was just the opening act. The reception cocktail hour was where Julian would begin moving his final pieces into alignment, and I needed to capture every word. By 4:30, the reception had shifted entirely to the cocktail terrace. I positioned myself near the east end of the bar, close enough to observe the dynamics, but far enough away to look like I was simply enjoying the evening breeze. Guests were mingling with champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres. Marcus and Sarah moved gracefully through the crowd, greeting family with the distinct glow of newlyweds. Mateo moved like a shadow, his camera capturing moments that looked completely spontaneous, but were entirely thick with tension. I watched Clara casually drift toward the edge of the terrace where Julian and Sylvia were standing, both of them scanning the crowd like generals assessing a battlefield. Clara's movement was effortless. Her hands slid into the pockets of her blazer. I knew the recording application on her phone was active. She had triggered it with a single tap 5 minutes ago. Under California's one-party consent laws, because she was an active participant in the conversation, the log was entirely sound. "Julian," she said, her tone so perfectly natural that none of the nearby guests paid any attention. "Have you seen the seating chart? I can't find my placard anywhere." Julian turned, his public smile snapping into place instantly. "It's on the main board by the entry, Clara. You're at table 4 with the cousins." "Thanks," Clara said, pretending to adjust her lapel while maintaining a perfect conversational distance. Julian turned back to Sylvia, his voice dropping into a low, quiet whisper that just managed to carry across the space. "Richard needs to stop shaking. It's a single signature, for God's sake. Sylvia's response was entirely controlled, cold, and quiet. Just ensure the notary is in position by 8 o'clock. She had just handed us the exact execution window, completely unaware that we were logging every single syllable. Clara's phone buzzed in her pocket, a ping I had routed to her through our secure application, giving her a natural exit ramp. She glanced at the screen, frowned slightly as if reviewing the business notification, and walked toward the gardens. I watched her disappear around the corner, knowing she was already transmitting the audio file directly to Diane. 4 minutes later, my phone vibrated, a text from Diane. Admirable work. The recording is entirely clean and admissible. Explicit intent, and a clear timeline documented in an open space with no expectation of privacy. We have them locked into 8 p.m. 3.5 hours left. 3.5 hours. In 3.5 hours, Julian would walk directly into a trap he didn't even know existed. I took a slow sip of my scotch and watched Richard Coburn standing entirely isolated near the entrance to the library. He held a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, looking exactly like a man waiting on a jury's verdict. At 5:15, I made my move. "Richard," I said quietly, approaching him from the side. He flinched violently as if I had actually struck him. "Arthur!" "Step inside with me," I said, gesturing toward the heavy door. He followed me into the first-floor library, the exact room where Eleanor used to read bedtime stories to the kids. I shut the door and turned the deadbolt. Richard stood in the center of the space, his knuckles white around the untouched glass. His hands were visibly trembling. I pulled 3 printed documents from my inside jacket pocket and laid them out neatly on the mahogany desk. "Document number 1, I said. "Server logs indicating the security feed for the second-floor library was cut at 6 a.m. today. It was executed using your administrative credentials from your personal tablet. The remaining color completely drained from Richard's face. Document number 2, I continued. A forensic lip-reading transcription of your conversation with Julian in that exact room yesterday afternoon. You were shaking your head, Richard. You were resisting, but you yielded anyway." The glass in his hand rattled against his ring. "And document number 3, the California Rules of Professional Conduct. Rule 8.4, specifically covering misconduct by legal counsel and trust advisors. I assume you're deeply familiar with it." The glass slipped from Richard's fingers, hitting the heavy rug with a dull thud. The whiskey soaked into the antique Persian carpet Eleanor had brought back from Istanbul years ago. "Richard," my voice dropped into the lowest register I used during corporate negotiations. The tone that signals a situation has become entirely critical. "I've known you for 20 years. Tell me exactly what leverage he has on you." He stood in complete silence for nearly 10 seconds. Then his shoulders caved, and he collapsed inward. 2018, he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I misappropriated $85,000 from a deceased client's estate. The family never noticed the discrepancy. I needed the liquidity to cover a severe gambling debt my ex-wife had run up." He paused, closing his eyes. "The reason doesn't even matter anymore. I took the capital, and Julian uncovered the transaction. Julian had been conducting an internal audit on our trust framework at the time. At 41, he was sharper than half the executives I employed. He had spotted the vulnerability in the ledger entries. Richard sank heavily into one of the leather reading chairs. He came into my office, shut the door, and told me he would handle it as a private favor between friends. He covered the discrepancy. All I had to do in return was remember that he had thrown me a lifeline when I needed it most. Richard had drafted Eleanor's will, attended Marcus's baptism, and sat at our Thanksgiving table for 2 decades. And Julian had held his entire life in a vice since he was 35 years old. "He waited 6 years, I said, until he needed someone with legal authority who could never say no to him. "I should have self-reported back then," Richard said, his voice thick with regret. "I should have faced the music. But I was in my early 50s, Arthur. I couldn't face losing everything I had spent my life building. So I said thank you, and I pretended it never happened." I pulled out the desk chair and sat down directly opposite him. "Here is exactly what happens next, Richard. You have exactly 2 choices." He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and entirely broken. "Choice number 1. Tomorrow morning I file a formal complaint with the California Department of Financial Protection and the State Bar. I hand over the evidence of your compliance in this takeover, your role in masking those unauthorized server overrides, and your assistance in Julian's attempt to defraud me of $320 million. Your license will be suspended immediately pending an investigation. You will face federal felony charges for embezzlement and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. Your career ends in total public ruin, and you will spend the rest of your life in a courtroom instead of retirement. Richard's breathing became incredibly shallow. Choice number 2, I continued, leaning in. You cooperate with me completely. You hand over every document, every email, and every piece of evidence tied to this conspiracy. You tell me exactly what role Sylvia plays in this, how that conservatorship was built, and what Julian's exact move is tonight. Then you self-report to the regulatory boards within 45 days and begin paying back the capital you misappropriated. If you do that, I won't file my formal complaint, but I won't protect you either. You face your consequences with the last shred of dignity you have left. I gave him 2 paths. One ended his career in total disgrace, and the other offered a chance to close the book on his own terms with some modicum of decency. It was more than he deserved and far less than he expected. He took the deal. What do you need? Richard whispered. The leverage Richard was about to hand over would dismantle Julian's legal trap from the inside out, because the man who drafted the trap always knows exactly where the structural flaws are. Richard stared at the whiskey puddle on the rug for what felt like an eternity. Then he set his empty glass upright, straightened his tie, and agreed to cooperate. I need 45 days, he said, his voice steadier than it had been since he walked into the room, to self-report to the board, fully repay the $85,000 with interest, and submit my resignation. I looked at him across the mahogany desk. You have it. But Richard, this is your only shot. No counteroffers, no room for renegotiation. Full cooperation or the deal is dead. I need every file, every email, every single detail about how Julian and Sylvia structured this takeover. If I find out you've hidden a single thing from me, Arthur, I'm done. I've carried this for 6 years and I am completely exhausted. Whatever happens to my career, at least the ending will be written by me, not dictated by them. Richard Coburn was going to lose his practice, his reputation, and the firm he built, but he chose to lose it on his own terms rather than remain a pawn in Julian's game. He pulled out his phone and opened his mail client. I'm forwarding everything to your attorney right now. The complete conservatorship transfer archive, all 15 pages, including every single revision Sylvia made over the last 8 weeks. The entire email correspondence between the 3 of us across the timeline of this project. He paused, scrolling through his contacts. And the routing numbers for the offshore accounts. What offshore accounts? The accounts Sylvia set up to receive her compensation once the transfer goes through, Richard said flatly. Cayman Islands, 15% of the trust's total asset value. If Julian secured control of the assets, Sylvia was positioned to clear $48 million. $48 million. This wasn't a family dispute or a brother looking out for his father's health. This was a cold-blooded corporate liquidation with a massive financial incentive. Sylvia drafted everything, Richard continued. Every clause, every contingency, every single structural element of that agreement. Julian just signed where she told him to sign. Your son is the muscle, Arthur, but Sylvia is the true architect. I pulled out my phone and dialed Diane. She picked up instantly. Diane, we have a cooperating witness, I said. Richard Coburn. He's connecting with your office immediately. Give him whatever secure uplink he needs. Files, emails, account numbers. He's cooperating fully. I'll have a formal proffer agreement drafted within the hour, Diane replied. Is he with you now? Right in front of me. Talk to him. I handed the phone to Richard. His hand shook slightly as he took it, but his grip was firm. This is Richard Coburn, he said. Yes, ma'am, I understand. 6 p.m. Eastern. I'll have the full transfer package ready for your team. He handed the phone back to me and I disconnected. Thank you, Arthur, Richard murmured. Don't thank me, I told him. You aren't escaping liability, Richard. You're just getting the chance to look it in the eye instead of being dragged through the mud in handcuffs. I know, he said, but that's a better ending than the one I had envisioned for myself. Richard left the library at 5:50 p.m. I watched him walk toward the dining pavilion where guests were finishing their cocktails and preparing to take their seats for dinner. He looked like a man who had been carrying a piano on his back for a decade and finally set it down. Between 6 and 6:30, the Sterling estate transformed into a tactical command center that the 200 wedding guests would never suspect. I signed the final digital waiver Diane pushed to my device, authorizing a direct live telemetry feed of the second-floor private wing to 2 plainclothes detectives from the Monterey County Sheriff's Department. Diane called at 6 Ling Wu to confirm they were stationed on the perimeter of the property with full video access. "Everything you do in that room tonight is evidence, Arthur," she said. "Every word, every gesture, every threat. The detectives will be watching the feed in real time. If anything compromises your safety, they can breach the room in under 30 seconds. "Understood," I said. Clara located me in a security blind spot at 6:15. "The projection system is synchronized," she reported. "The second you give the signal, I can override the ballroom's main display array. Every document is loaded into the queue, the server logs, the emails to Singapore, the terrace audio recordings, and Richard's signed confession. Test the override," I instructed. She pulled up her tablet and struck a sequence of keys. The massive projector screen in the ballroom, which was currently looping engagement photos of Marcus and Sarah for the arriving guests, flickered once, went entirely black, and then displayed a single line of text. "System override active." Clara struck another key and the engagement photos returned seamlessly. "Perfect," I said. Matteo appeared with his camera rig at 6:25. "Final telemetry check on the concealed lenses. The video feeds from all 3 angles are completely stable. Audio is crisp. They won't have any idea they're being logged until the trap springs." I stood before the monitoring displays, looking at the feeds from across the estate. Guests laughing on the terrace, catering staff setting down the final courses in the ballroom, and the empty second-floor library waiting silently for its targets. Then I stepped into the adjoining washroom and looked at myself in the mirror. For the first time all day, I didn't see a grieving widower struggling to protect his children from tearing each other apart. I saw the man who had built Sterling Aerospace from a draft board in a cramped garage with nothing but a blueprint and a refusal to yield. The man who had survived hostile takeovers, proxy wars, and boardroom knife fights for 3 decades. The man who knew that in any negotiation, the most valuable skill is knowing exactly when to stop being reasonable. Julian thought he was stealing from a retired grieving father who had grown soft with age. He had absolutely no idea whose house he was actually standing in. 30 years of business had taught me one unshakable rule. Never underestimate an opponent who has already lost the thing that mattered most to him. By 6:30, the pieces were locked into position. The only remaining variable was Julian himself. And I had spent 30 years learning that the most dangerous assumption you can make in a negotiation is that your opponent will behave rationally. Rational or not, his move was coming, and I was entirely prepared for the impact. He located me precisely on schedule at 7 p.m., just as I was standing by the second-floor window where Eleanor used to watch the Pacific during our dinner parties. Julian always had an eye for staging. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with the exact cadence of a devoted older son, "I've been looking for you everywhere." I turned away from the glass. Outside, the ocean stretched into a dark, bottomless abyss. This was the view Eleanor loved. This was the view that would still be here when tonight was completely over. "Just getting some air," I said. "It's been a long day." Julian walked down the corridor, the fabric of his expensive suit making a faint rustle. His smile was warm, or at least it looked warm. His shoulders were relaxed, his posture open. He carried himself with the absolute confidence of a man who believed he had already won. "I wanted to touch base with you before things get too chaotic with the dinner service," he said casually. "Richard has a few routine trust update documents ready for us. It's strictly a formality, but given the recent changes in estate planning, we figured it makes sense to execute them while everyone is under one roof tonight." "Trust updates," I repeated. "Standard administrative cleanup. he said, waving a hand dismissively. Just updating some beneficiary definitions and clarifying a few distribution protocols. Richard said it shouldn't take more than 10 minutes. We can slip up to the library right after the toasts around 8 o'clock and get it knocked out. He expected my cognitive decline to manifest by 8. He figured I'd be confused, exhausted, and vulnerable enough to sign whatever asset assignment he placed in front of me. The sheer arrogance in his voice told me everything I needed to know. 8 o'clock works fine, I said. His smile widened. Perfect. I'll let Richard know. You should head back down to the pavilion. Marcus was looking for you. He gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze and turned back toward the ballroom, his leather dress shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I waited until he cleared the corner before stepping into the washroom at the end of the hall and locking the door. I fired off 3 encrypted texts in rapid succession. To Diane, North Wing, second door, room 1955. Hand the telemetry payload to Mateo. The execution window opens at 2000 hours. To Dr. Thorne, confirm protocol 7 active. To Clara, the countdown is live. 3 responses flash back within 30 seconds. Confirmed. In position and standing by. Acknowledge. I looked in the mirror one last time. 68 years old, immaculate tuxedo, perfectly straight boutonniere, posture entirely unbroken. My face looked identical to how it had at 6 a.m., but there was something entirely different behind my eyes now. 30 years of boardroom warfare had been distilled down into the next 60 minutes. Eleanor had stood by this exact window in 1998, watching storm clouds roll over the water. The ocean never compromises, Arthur, she had told me. It takes exactly what it wants, and it never explains itself. I slid my device into my pocket and walked back into the ballroom. The reception dinner was in full swing. 200 guests sat at beautifully decorated tables, the ambient chatter hitting a crescendo. Marcus and Sarah sat at the center of the head table, both of them radiating the distinct energy of newlyweds, their joy making the rest of the room fade into background noise. I took my seat at the family table. Clara sat to my left, Julian sat 2 spots over, and Sylvia and Richard sat directly opposite us. Julian glanced down at his phone display. 7:32. 3 minutes later, his eyes flicked to the screen again. 7:35. Another 3 minutes passed. 7:38. He was counting down the seconds. He needed to make sure his timeline hadn't slipped, ensuring every single move was driving steadily toward the 8 p.m. trap. Sylvia leaned in closer to Richard, whispering something completely out of my earshot. Richard gave a strained nod, his hand reaching up to nervously adjust his tie. They were in total sync, moving to the rhythm of the exact same internal clock. "Dad, are you feeling all right?" Marcus called out with genuine concern from the head table. "You haven't touched a single bite of your food." "Just saving my appetite for the main course later tonight, son," I replied, giving him a reassuring smile. Marcus laughed and turned back to talk to Sarah. He was completely in the dark. Aside from the 3 people at this exact table who were counting down the moments until they could strip our family legacy bare, nobody had any idea what was coming. I spent the rest of the course studying Richard's micro-expressions, the tense, dry swallowing, his eyes deliberately avoiding mine, and the slight, unmistakable tremor in his fingers every time he reached for his water glass. Richard had flipped. He had already handed me the keys to their kingdom, but Julian and Sylvia were still completely blind to it. Sylvia maintained her flawless, elegant posture, her hands resting calmly in her lap, presenting the absolute picture of high society composure. But I had spent 30 years reading adversaries across negotiating tables. I saw the predatory patience locked in the tight line of her jaw, and the calculated focus every time she tracked Julian's movements as he checked his phone. 7:45. The ballroom's massive crystal chandeliers, the ones containing 18,000 individual crystals that I had installed the summer Marcus was born, fractured the ambient light across the polished silverware and white linens. Every reflection felt like a countdown. Every single shimmer marked another second shaved off the clock before 8 p.m. The servers cleared away the main entries and set down the desserts. Coffee was poured. 7:48. Julian's phone vibrated against the table. He glanced down, fired off a rapid response, and flipped the device face down. 7:50. Exactly 10 minutes left. I looked across the expanse of the pavilion and caught Matteo standing near the main entrance with his rig. He met my gaze and gave me a single microscopic nod. Everything was fully operational. Clara sat quietly right beside me, her device tucked into her blazer pocket, the multimedia override application loaded and running silently in the background. Marcus stood up at the head table, tapping his spoon against his champagne flute to draw the room's attention. Before we open the floor for the dances, I'd love to say a few words. His voice boomed through the pavilion. The chatter died down instantly, and 200 guests turned their focus to the groom. "This is without a doubt the greatest day of my life," Marcus said, keeping a steady arm around Sarah's waist. "I want to thank every single person in this room for being a part of it. But most importantly, I want to thank my family. My brother, my sister, and my dad. If Mom were here to see this morning, she would be completely overjoyed." Julian's public smile didn't waver for a fraction of a second. He applauded right along with the rest of the room, playing the part of the devoted older brother and perfect son flawlessly. But as Marcus took his seat and the applause began to fade, Julian caught my eye from across the table. He deliberately tapped his phone screen, flashing me a smirk of absolute certainty. He was entirely confident he knew exactly what was about to happen in 10 minutes. He thought he was telegraphing my imminent collapse. He thought that gesture was a countdown to my confusion, my vulnerability, and the moment I would desperately sign whatever document he placed in front of me. He had absolutely no idea how I was actually reading that gesture. He had no idea that every time he checked his phone, every whispered coordination with Sylvia, and every panicked glance from Richard had already been cataloged, logged, and secured. He had no idea that the detectives actively monitoring the live telemetry feed had spent the last 3 hours watching his entire countdown performance, and he had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him upstairs. 10 minutes to 8. Julian's smirk deepened as he tapped the glass. He believed he was counting down to my surrender. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that he was marking the final seconds before his own empire dissolved into absolute ash. At 8 o'clock sharp, the library door clicked shut behind me. The smile vanished from Julian's face instantly, looking exactly like someone had severed the power to a display. The transformation was total and immediate. The warm, devoted sun from 30 seconds ago in the hallway was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp focus. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place felt incredibly loud in the quiet room. "Sit down, Dad," he said, his voice dropping into a flat, commanding rhythm, the exact clinical tone he used when squeezing founders during a venture capital audit. The library looked identical to how it had when Matteo and Clara deployed the concealed lenses earlier today. The antique mahogany desk sat in the center, flanked by 2 leather armchairs, with walls lined with legal treatises that hadn't been pulled from their shelves in a decade. Through the glass, the faint sounds of the reception continued 2 floors below. I remained standing. Julian stepped up to the desk and laid a thick legal document flat on the polished wood. It was a perfect 15-page ledger matching Richard's description down to the millimeter. "This is designed to protect your holdings in the event of a shift in your health," he said, keeping his tone entirely clinical. "Dr. Thorne has documented some serious concerns regarding your cognitive performance. It's nothing critical yet, but it's substantial enough that we need to establish the proper administrative guardrails." "What concerns, Julian?" He pulled a secondary file from the folder, the psychiatric evaluation bearing Dr. Aris Thorne's signature, declaring me mentally incompetent due to advanced cognitive decline. "Manifestations of executive disorientation," he said smoothly. "Severe short-term memory lapses. It's entirely natural at your age, Dad, but it requires a structured legal framework to ensure the family trust remains properly managed." I looked down at the paperwork, then up at his face, and then back down at the signature page. "I see," I said softly. He slid a heavy Mont Blanc pen across the mahogany desk. It came to a rest precisely between us. A clear ultimatum. "Sign the assignment, Dad," he said, a cold edge creeping into his voice. "Let's not make this any more difficult than it needs to be." I picked up the document and slowly turned to the first page, reviewing the language. It designated Julian Sterling as sole irrevocable conservator, effective immediately upon endorsement, granting total administrative control over all trust capital and aerospace defense patents. The unsigned agreement lay between us, representing a decade of calculations on his part, all built on the assumption that I was simply too old to notice. "You've put an extraordinary amount of work into this," I remarked, "and all of it is to protect me." I looked up. "Did Richard draft this?" I asked, though I already possessed the answer. Richard established the legal parameters. Yes, with Sylvia providing advisory consultation. I set the document back down on the desk, leaving the pen completely untouched. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the space. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3. Julian's calculated composure began to show its first real fractures. Tiny telltale signs, the tightening around the corners of his eyes, the rapid tapping of his finger against his thigh, and a subtle shift in his weight. "Dad," he said, the sharp edge in his voice breaking through completely, "I need you to sign the paperwork." "Why?" "Because I am trying to shield you from—" "Shield me from what?" He pulled his phone from his pocket, tapped the display, and turned the screen directly toward me. It was a security video clip. The timestamp indicated it was taken 3 weeks ago. A high-angle capture from a pharmacy security system he had clearly secured through a backdoor contact. On the screen, I was standing at a counter speaking to a pharmacist. The audio was muffled but entirely legible. My voice was asking if they still carried Eleanor's prescription refills on file. The pharmacist gently responded, reminding me that Mrs. Sterling had passed away over 2 years ago. The camera logged my confusion, my quiet apology, and the heavy way I turned to walk out of the store. Julian let the clip run for exactly 15 seconds before hitting pause. "If I route this telemetry to the Aerospace Board," he whispered, "they will strip your honorary chairmanship immediately and demand a full federal audit of every defense contract signed prior to your departure. If I leak it to the financial press, the narrative becomes a multi-million-dollar defense firm, managed by a founder suffering from cognitive decay. Your entire 30-year legacy dissolves in 48 hours. Or you sign the voluntary assignment tonight, ensure the trust assets remain secure, and we handle this quietly as a family." He had weaponized the raw grief of a widower asking for his late wife's medicine, turning a moment of human heartbreak into a tool for extortion. I looked down at the display, then back up at Julian. I let my gaze lift toward the corner crown molding where Mateo's microlens was nested, pausing for a single calculated second. To the naked eye, it was completely invisible. Then I brought my eyes back to my oldest son. "Is that everything?" I asked. The question hit the room like a stone dropping into a void. Julian's expression faltered, first into sheer confusion, then into the cold realization of something that looked a lot like fear. "Is that everything?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Dad, you don't seem to comprehend the leverage I hold. Is this the absolute extent of your hand, Julian?" I asked again, keeping my tone perfectly level. A clip of a grieving man asking for his late wife's prescription out of muscle memory? What exactly do you think that proves? It establishes a pattern of mental incompetence. It proves you are incapable of managing your capital. It proves that a man who was married to his wife for 38 years occasionally forgets she is gone, I said. That isn't dementia, Julian. That is the trauma of losing the center of your life. His grip tightened around his phone. "The Department of Defense Review Board won't see it that way," he threatened, though the absolute certainty had completely vanished from his voice. "They will see a son attempting to blackmail his father using his grief," I countered. "They will see an operator who recorded a private moment of mourning to use as a bargaining chip in an asset grab. I am not signing your agreement." The silence that followed was entirely different from the last. This was a heavy, suffocating silence loaded with immediate, permanent consequences. Julian stared at me. I watched his mind frantically recalculate, watching him realize that the leverage he thought was infallible wasn't working. watching him comprehend that his beautifully engineered conspiracy had completely broken down. "Dad," he said, and for the first time all night, he sounded entirely uncertain. "You have to sign this." "No," I replied simply, "I don't." He looked down at the documents, then at the untouched pen, and then back at me standing entirely unyielding before him. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "The truth," I said. "Exactly how much debt are you holding, Julian?" His face went entirely bloodless. He had brought a blackmail video to prove a grieving husband had asked for a prescription out of habit, believing he had found evidence of dementia. And in doing so, he had exposed something far more dangerous. He had absolutely no idea what real evidence actually looked like. At 8:18 p.m., the library door opened without a knock. Sylvia stepped into the room, carrying herself with the exact same authority as if she had purchased the entire estate this morning. She didn't look at me. Her focus went straight to Julian, a silent exchange passing between them, a signal, a confirmation, a total shift in command. "Julian," Sylvia said, her voice dropping into a low, icy whisper, "step back. Let me handle this." A flash of something crossed Julian's face. Maybe shame, maybe relief. Without a word of protest, he retreated toward the window. Sylvia turned her full attention to me. Now I was looking at the woman who had spent a decade in Wall Street, investment firms, structuring billion-dollar hostile takeovers. The social warmth she had displayed at 11 Thanksgiving dinners was completely gone. Standing in front of me was a financial predator, pure and simple. "Arthur," she said, her voice carrying the cold, analytical precision of someone who had spent decades dominating boardrooms, "we are long past the point of negotiation." "Sylvia," I replied, "I didn't expect you to handle this personally. It seems Julian's hands still aren't steady enough." She glanced at my oldest son, and the contempt in her eyes was surgically precise. Julian's jaw tightened, but he kept his mouth shut. Sylvia stepped up to the desk, picked up the conservatorship agreement, and laid it back down squarely between us. "Here's exactly what happens next," she said. "You either sign this paperwork right now, or first thing Monday morning, we file an involuntary petition with the Monterey Superior Court. Under the California Probate Code, those hearings are entirely public. Every humiliating detail in your psychiatric evaluation will be entered into the public record. Your grandchildren will read it. The Wall Street Journal will cover it. And you will spend the next 6 months of your life trapped in endless depositions and mental fitness examinations, watching your lifelong reputation dissolve on a live feed." I looked at this woman I had known for 11 years, the same woman who had sat at my Thanksgiving table, brought wine, shared jokes, and wept at Eleanor's funeral. "Or," Sylvia continued, "you sign it quietly right now. We handle the transition of the trust with absolute discretion. No public hearings, no media, no courtrooms. Just a seamless succession that protects everyone's dignity, including yours." I stared at her, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "This isn't about my health at all, is it?" I said. "What's your cut, Sylvia? 15%? 20? "Under the California Probate Code," I declared before the 200 witnesses, unfolding the pages, "I'm executing an immediate amendment to the Sterling Family Trust. Effective right now, the $320 million in trust assets are assigned in equal shares to my daughter, Clara Sterling, and my son, Marcus Sterling. Mateo Vega will assume the role of independent trustee and fiduciary advisor." Someone dropped a silver fork. The metallic clatter sounded exactly like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Julian Sterling is hereby stripped of all beneficiary status, power of attorney, and trustee designations permanently. The conservatorship handover executed under documented duress 38 minutes ago is completely null and void. The notary process overseen by Sylvia Vance, who is currently en route to the Central Holding Facility on charges of structured fraud and extortion, carries zero legal weight." I looked directly into the camera lens Mateo had repositioned, the same hidden lens that had logged Julian's compliance in the library. There are deficits that money can never balance. My son was drowning under $65 million in debt. I had the capital secured the entire time. All he had to do was ask his father for help rather than try to destroy him. The silence broke. A wave of intense whispering swept across the tables like a wind through a valley. Marcus married the love of his life tonight, I continued, my voice catching slightly as I said my youngest son's name. That reality remains entirely true. It remains something worth defending. So I ask you, if you can find it in yourselves to compose your spirits, stay, dance, toast this innocent couple on what was supposed to be the most beautiful night of their lives. I folded the amendment and handed it to Matteo, who stepped forward to log his signature as a witness and co-signatory. His hand shook slightly as he pressed the pen to the page. "It's secure, Arthur," he murmured. "It's finally over." The digital notary Diane had positioned near the entrance earlier in the evening stepped up, pressing her official seal onto the final page. A closed loop, engineered down to 100 separate details. The amendment was certified, witnessed, and legally binding. But in my heart, I knew that a legal victory and actual redemption are two entirely different metrics. The band leader stepped hesitantly to the edge of the stage. She was a woman in her late 60s, her eyes kind, her violin tucked loosely under her arm. "Mr. Sterling," she asked softly, "what would you like us to play?" I almost told her to play nothing at all. I almost told her to pack up her gear, that enough beautiful things had been shattered in this room tonight. But then I saw Marcus step out from the shadows of the corridor, his face lined with tears, his fingers tightly locked in Sarah's hand. My son looked at me across the expanse of 200 people and a massive, fresh chasm of grief. I read the determination in his eyes. "Play their first dance," I told the conductor. "Play it exactly as if nothing happened." The strings struck up, easing into Etta James's "At Last." I watched my youngest son guide his bride onto the empty hardwood floor. Before a room of guests who had just witnessed an arrest, Marcus pulled Sarah close, and the two of them began to sway in the center of the pavilion. Then slowly other couples stood up. Matteo took his wife's hand and glided into the space. Clara stepped forward with her partner. Pair by pair, the guests chose to dance instead of flee, choosing to believe that devotion could survive the wreckage of this night. In the exact room that had just hosted deep betrayal, I stood at the edge of the parquet floor, watching Marcus rest his forehead against Sarah's. His shoulders were moving, and from 20 feet away I couldn't tell if it was laughter or a sob. The boy who used to call me at dawn just to verify I was okay. The biologist who dedicated his life to protecting fragile things because he understood how vulnerable the world really is. The son who had never asked me for a single asset, only my presence. Diane appeared right at my elbow. The sharp courtroom armor she carried all day had softened into something far more human. "You gave them a choice," she said, watching the floor, "to stay and dance or to walk away. You reminded them that this is a tragedy, Arthur, not the end of the world. That's a gift." "It doesn't feel like a gift, Diane. It isn't supposed to. Redemption never feels like a victory. It just feels like survival." As the song faded out and the next began, Marcus kissed Sarah's temple, guided her off the floor, and walked straight toward me. I braced myself for the impact, prepared for the anger, prepared for the blame, prepared for the exact invoice you have to pay when you secure your wealth, but lose a piece of your family. Instead, Marcus stepped forward in front of everyone and pulled me into a tight, lingering embrace. "Thank you," he whispered right against my shoulder. "Thank you for not letting him win completely." He stepped back, wiped his eyes with the heel of his palm, and walked back over to his bride. The dance floor filled right back up. The bartenders resumed pouring champagne. 200 people had made a collective, conscious decision to keep the celebration alive, even after it had been detonated from the inside out. It wasn't because the trauma had miraculously healed, but because moving forward was the only actual answer left on the board. I walked through the French doors and stepped back out onto the terrace where this whole day had begun, at dawn. The succulent garden glowed softly under the landscape lights, looking pristine and entirely oblivious to the storm. My phone vibrated in my hand, a text from Matteo. "Police confirm both targets are officially booked and processed. Arraignment scheduled for Monday morning. Before you sleep tonight, Arthur, you need to read the second page of Eleanor's letter. She knew, Arthur. She knew all along. I looked back through the heavy glass. Marcus was dancing with one of his colleagues. Clara was quietly packing her laptop back into its case, and the guests who had just seen my son's wedding turn into a masterclass on family resilience were continuing the night. I stared down at Matteo's text, realizing that the hardest conversation of my life was still waiting for me, inside the envelope I had been too terrified to finish reading. Redemption doesn't just hit you all at once. It rolls in like waves on the shoreline, and the second wave was about to crash. At 11 p.m., I quietly retreated to the library because I needed to hear Eleanor's voice one last time. Outside, the remaining guests were still dancing, and Clara had already driven home. But Matteo's text about the second page of Eleanor's letter, the part I had been too afraid to read while preparing for battle at dawn, was weighing heavily on me. I pulled the letter from my inside vest pocket, the paper now soft and warm from being pressed against my chest all day. I had read the first page at sunrise, the directives for the trust modifications, and her hauntingly accurate premonition of Julian's trajectory. But the second page had felt far too raw, far too personal to absorb while structuring a war. Now, with my oldest son in a holding cell and my youngest son still standing, I unfolded the script under the warm glow of the banker's lamp on the desk. Arthur, if you are reading these words, it means my fears were correct. I am so incredibly sorry. I am sorry I couldn't fix him. And I am so sorry that it has to fall on you to be the one to sever the tie. My wife had penned those words 2 years ago. 18 months before she passed away, Eleanor had already accepted the brutal reality I had spent months trying to deny, that our oldest son had set himself on a path that was destined to end exactly like this. I tried for 36 years, Arthur. Every therapist, every intervention, every opportunity I could give him. He is as brilliant as he is broken, and I don't know which part came first. But Clara and Marcus need a father who stands for the truth, far more than they need an older brother who lives a lie. You have always known exactly when a structure is beyond repair. Trust your judgment. I rested the pages on the mahogany desk, leaning my weight against the polished wood that had once belonged to my grandfather. Eleanor had given me her blessing in ink, long before she ever knew the names Sylvia Vance or Lion City Defense, or the specifics of a forged power of attorney. Even before the details had materialized, she had mapped out the exact parameters of tonight. I love you, Arthur. Those words sat right at the very bottom of the page. No lengthy explanations, no dramatic formatting, just the foundational bedrock that had supported our lives for 43 years. I carefully refolded the pages and slid them back into my vest pocket, pressing them right back against my heart. They would stay there permanently. 2 years ago, Eleanor had left this world with the absolute certainty of what I would have to face tonight, leaving behind her forgiveness written in ink. The library door pushed open silently. Matteo stood in the frame, his tie loosened, his heavy camera bag still slung over one shoulder. I figured I'd find you in here, he said quietly. I motioned toward the leather chair opposite the desk. Matteo took a seat, settling into the kind of comfortable silence that is only earned between people who no longer need to fill every pause with words. You didn't have to name me as the independent trustee, Arthur, he finally remarked. 6 years ago, when Clara had that catastrophic car accident, and we were sitting outside the ICU, not knowing if she'd ever walk again, you sat in that hospital waiting room for 4 straight days. You brought coffee, and you never once asked if I wanted you to stay. You just stayed. That's the kind of man I want, looking out for my kids. Matteo looked down at his calloused hands. But that's a very different thing from managing $320 million. It's the exact same thing, I told him. A trustee's job isn't about managing capital, Matteo. It's about standing firm when everything else collapses. He nodded slowly, letting the philosophy settle. Do the kids know? Clara knows. I'll walk Marcus through the details tomorrow morning. Julian's allocation has been legally vacated and split between his siblings, Matteo noted. He's going to face federal fraud and extortion indictments with absolutely zero trust liquidity to fight them. He frowned slightly, but he didn't argue. He understood that some betrayals completely sever the ties that capital is supposed to represent. "Come on," he said, standing up and adjusting his bag. "You've been trapped inside this room for too long?" I followed him through the double doors and out onto the east terrace. The Pacific Ocean stretched into a pitch-black abyss beyond the stone railing, the heavy crash of the waves entirely audible but completely invisible in the dark. The pavilion glowed brightly behind us, the ambient music drifting out through the open windows. Eleanor used to look out at this exact water every single morning from our bedroom upstairs, I said, leaning against the cold stone. During the last 6 months of her life, she told me that the hardest part about dying is knowing exactly who you have to leave behind, and knowing exactly who is going to be perfectly fine without you. "She knew you'd make it through, Arthur. She knew I would survive," I corrected. "Those are two entirely different things." Matteo reached into his leather pouch and pulled out his camera, the worn Leica he had carried for 15 years. He slowly brought it to his eye, aligning the lens directly with me. I stood there against the railing, framed by the dark ocean behind me and the brightly lit ballroom to my left. I didn't pose, I didn't straighten my collar, and I didn't adjust my expression. I just stood there, letting the camera capture every single day of my 68 years. The shutter clicked sharply. "Did it turn out well?" I asked, without turning around. "It's a completely honest photograph," Matteo murmured. He lowered the camera and joined me at the railing. Below us, the tide crashed against the private shoreline with a rhythm that was far older than wealth, family, or deep betrayal. "Do you know the difference between an employee and a trustee, Arthur?" Matteo asked. "Tell me." "An employee manages assets. A trustee protects people. You just handed me that second responsibility, Arthur, and that means everything to me." "I know exactly what it means," I said. "That's why I handed it to you." A small, genuine smile broke through the darkness on his face. "Then I'm going to make sure I do it right." We stood in the quiet as the band inside transitioned to a new track. Marcus's laughter carried out through the open doors, clear, sharp, and entirely surprising. My youngest son was dancing at his own wedding reception just 4 hours after watching his older brother leave in handcuffs. He chose life because the alternative meant surrendering to the void. Matteo raised his camera one last time, but this time he faced the pavilion, capturing a frame of Marcus and Sarah spinning beneath the crystal chandeliers. He lowered the rig and packed it securely into his bag. "That's the photograph you're going to want to look at years from now," he said. "Not the one where you look broken by the weight of it all. The one where Marcus keeps dancing." "Keep both," I told him. "The truth usually lives somewhere right in the middle." Matteo nodded, turning back toward the French doors. "I'm heading out. You should get some sleep, Arthur. Monday's arraignment is going to be an incredibly brutal day." "I know." He paused right in the doorway, looking back. "He's still your son." "I know that too," I said. "That's exactly why it hurts this much." He disappeared into the light of the house, leaving me entirely alone with the Pacific and Eleanor's letter pressed against my chest. Somewhere in a holding cell, Julian was learning the raw geometry of a prison wall from the inside. In the ballroom, my children were learning how to stand perfectly straight when the foundation drops out from beneath them. And Matteo's lens had captured the one frame I could never pose for. A 68-year-old father who had just hand-delivered his oldest son to the authorities to save the children he had left, standing entirely alone, holding his late wife's wisdom against his heart. That photograph will never hang in a public gallery, but it remains the only honest record of what it actually costs to win a war like this. At 11:45 p.m., Marcus appeared on the terrace, one arm securely wrapped around Sarah's waist as he guided her out into the cool air. "Come inside for the last dance, Dad," he said softly. "Do it for Mom." There were only about 40 guests left inside the pavilion. The band was already packing away their equipment cases, and the chandeliers had been dimmed to half power. The conductor caught sight of us and signaled to her players. They pulled out a single violin and a cello. It was Eleanor's favorite song, the exact track we had used at our own wedding 38 years ago. The four of us formed a loose, quiet circle on the empty parquet floor. Clara rested her hand firmly on my shoulder. Marcus held Sarah close against him, and I stood in the space where Eleanor was supposed to be. I closed my eyes, waiting for some mystical shift, some supernatural sign that she was bearing witness to us. But there was only the music, the steady sound of my children breathing beside me, and the profound reality that when you love someone deeply enough, they never actually leave you. They become a permanent part of your posture, a core instinct that tells you exactly which way to turn when everyone else has left the room and there is nobody left to ask. She would have absolutely despised what happened tonight, Clara whispered, her voice cracking slightly. But she would be so incredibly proud of you, Dad. I opened my eyes and looked at my daughter, the brilliant engineer who had projected the evidence before 200 witnesses. Your mother knew exactly what this night would cost 2 years ago, I told her. She left a letter authorizing me to do exactly what had to be done. The music drew to a close. Marcus stepped forward and pulled me into one final embrace, briefer than the first, but entirely unyielding. Go get some rest, Dad, he murmured against my ear. You look like you've aged a decade today. It feels more like 20 years, son, I replied. The three of them walked out of the pavilion together, Sarah's white gown catching the dim glow of the remaining chandeliers. I watched them leave, understanding completely that rebuilding a family means accepting the shape of the pieces you have left, rather than mourning the fragment that consciously chose to break away. The last guest left at 10 minutes to midnight. I stood on the entrance steps, watching the taillights fade down the private drive, with the Pacific roaring unseen down below. Mateo had left a bit earlier. Diane had already driven back, too. The estate dissolved back into the quiet in the immediate aftermath. 4 miles inland, a small-town church bell struck midnight, Julian's deadline, the exact moment his forged documentation was supposed to trigger. The Sterling Family Trust remained entirely under my control. $320 million, 15 core patents, the Silicon Valley commercial footprint, the Lake Tahoe estate, and things far more precious than any of it. 2 children who now knew the absolute truth, a daughter-in-law who had proven her loyalty, and a debt of honor to Mateo that had finally been repaid. I pulled the black notebook from my jacket pocket. 28 days of contingency plans, legal maneuvers, and timeline predictions. Every single step I had tracked, and every countermove I had engineered. I tore out the first page, letting the ocean wind sweep it away, then the second page, the third, and the fourth. The loose pages scattered out toward the dark Pacific, like tactical parameters I no longer had any use for. 28 days of calculated warfare dissolved entirely into the salt air. By 7 minutes past midnight, my hands were completely empty. I walked back inside, locked the French doors, and climbed the stairs to the master bedroom where Eleanor had passed away 2 years ago, and where I had slept entirely alone ever since. Tomorrow would bring a barrage of lawyers and headlines. Tonight, I needed sleep. I woke up at 6 a.m., same hour, same room, same expansive ocean view, and yet everything had changed. Not a single object in the room had been moved. The most brutal reality of an aftermath is that the furniture doesn't rearrange itself to acknowledge the wreckage of what just happened. I brewed a cup of terrible coffee and walked out to the front porch. I sat down in the wicker armchair where Eleanor used to read her novels on Sunday mornings. The sun broke over the Pacific, rising exactly as it had yesterday, and exactly as it would tomorrow, deeply familiar, yet entirely foreign. Mateo's pickup truck rumbled up the driveway at 6:15. He climbed out carrying 2 cups of coffee from a shop in town and his worn camera bag slung over his shoulder. Couldn't sleep? I asked. I slept fine. Just figured you might want a cup of coffee that actually tastes better than the battery acid you brew inside. He was right. I took the cup and tasted a welcome bit of civilization. Mateo sat down in the chair beside me, pulling out his phone. He scrolled for a second and then turned the screen toward me. It was an incredible photograph, the frame he had captured last night on the East Terrace. Me standing against the stone railing with the warm glow of the pavilion behind me, facing a pitch-black ocean with Eleanor's letter resting against my chest, while my oldest son sat in handcuffs in a patrol unit 200 feet away. It's a completely honest photograph, I said. I studied my own reflection in the display. I looked a year older, but I felt 20 years lighter. The mathematics of letting go never balanced cleanly on a ledger. My suit was rumpled, my tie sat slightly crooked, the posture of a man who had won every tactical engagement, yet still paid a devastating strategic price. "Do you want me to purge the file?" Matteo asked. "No, keep it. 20 years from now, if Marcus or Clara ever ask what it actually cost to survive that night, show them this frame." Matteo nodded, slipping the device back into his pocket. We sat in silence, sipping our coffee as the sun climbed higher into the sky. The ocean continued its eternal, rhythmic work, a constant reminder that everything eventually passes, yet nothing ever truly stands still. "My contact's called," Matteo said after a long pause. "The arraignment is locked for Monday morning at 9 a.m. They're hitting Julian with conspiracy to commit grand larceny, attempted fraud, and extortion, both federal and state indictments. Sylvia is looking at a minimum of 20 years. As for Julian, it depends entirely on his next move, whether he turns on Sylvia to cut a deal or tries to protect her." He paused, looking out at the water. "He's still your son, Arthur." "I know," I said quietly. "That's exactly why it hurts this much." Matteo finished his coffee and stood up, adjusting his bag. "I'll see you Monday. Courtroom 7B. Don't be late." "I'm never late." He walked back to his truck, pausing with his hand resting on the driver's side door. "You did the right thing, Arthur. Eleanor knew it. Your kids know it. And eventually, you'll know it too." Then he drove away, leaving me entirely alone with my terrible coffee and a completely honest photograph. The morning sun continued to rise over the exact same ocean that had witnessed Julian's destruction just hours before. The coffee was bitter, and the picture was unyielding. I sat there carrying the full weight of the choices I had made, while knowing with absolute clarity exactly why I had made them. The lawyers would take months to sort through the wreckage. The headlines would fade in a matter of days, and Julian would have to make his final choice. But sitting there on that porch, holding that terrible coffee and that honest photograph, I finally understood the truth Eleanor had carried all along. The most valuable asset in any legacy isn't the capital you accumulate. It's the people you can trust to protect it when the world falls apart. Some wars find you, no matter how hard you try to avoid them. The only variable that matters is whether you are prepared for the impact when they finally land on your doorstep. For those of you listening to this story today, never forget, the most devastating battles are the ones fought right under your own roof. I spent 40 years building an empire for my children, naively believing that wealth and security could shield them from the harsh realities of this world. I was dead wrong. True protection comes from anchoring them in truth, integrity, and personal accountability. I wish I had understood sooner that giving Julian everything he ever demanded didn't prepare him for the world. It only left him utterly defenseless against the first moment he couldn't manipulate reality to get his way. That was my failure as a father, and it's a burden I carry to this day. Betrayal from your own flesh and blood leaves a scar that goes right to the bone, because it comes from the very people who were supposed to stand beside you in the dark. When your own blood turns on you, the fabric of your memories fractures, and you start to question if anything you ever believed was real. But I've learned that protecting the people who still choose the truth doesn't mean you've abandoned the one who chose the lie. Some doors have to be shut permanently. I have to believe that the universe allows certain structures to break completely so we can finally see who we were meant to protect and who we were merely enabling. Sometimes the heaviest love you can show someone is learning how to say no. If this story resonated with you, or if you think someone else needs to hear it, I would deeply appreciate it if you shared it. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to face a deep betrayal within your own family? How did you protect yourself, and how did you shield the people who still relied on you to be their anchor? If you believe in the value of these lessons, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support allows me to keep sharing these heavy, essential truths that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I read every single comment, and your perspectives mean the world to me. As a final note, While certain narrative elements of this story were modified for storytelling purposes, the underlying lessons about family, betrayal, and the heavy burden of hard choices are entirely real. I'm incredibly grateful for your company today.